Ladies and gentlemen, hello. You can indeed hear me because this is the Big Boys Table, episode 34.
Hello.
I'm here with Mesk. We're talking about tools for your players, man. If you're making a game or you're thinking about making anything interactive, you want to figure out what tools you can give your players to actually play your game, then that's great. And since I know somebody who's making a game, he's actually here. He's you. Let's talk.
He's you.
He's you.
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 I'm you. But you are you. Who is the real you?
I am many people. I have been known by many names throughout the centuries. You can call me Narud.
Narud. Don't you mean Duran? Gasp! What
Holy
a shocking
shit.
plot revelation. Holy shit!
Metzen does it again.
Okay, so player tools.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I should say before we get started, the reason why I call it tools and not like any other term is I actually was struggling to come up with a title for this particular episode. The main issue that I have is like I don't really want to call it just player tools. Because for me, like the tools that you use in the game should be relatively similar to the tools that your opponents use so that you're on some sort of even footing when it comes to playing the game. And obviously this is going to be wildly different depending on which game type you're making. So it'll be interesting to like compare how you're handling stuff with your ARPG concepts compared to like RTS stuff, which is a little bit more like, you know, I guess even keeled from the get-go. You would think of it anyways as more even keeled to begin with. So I kind of want to sort of initially define this as we're not just talking about human players. We're also talking about like anybody who's on the map in the level and fighting would be considered a player for the purpose of this particular like discussion, I think. So feel free to like talk about how you're going to handle AI stuff as well as just stuff that the human player themselves can use in a single player context.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, from the get-go, part of my plan is to close that gap. So I don't really think of it as tools in a sense. I just think of it as like core philosophies. Well, in an RTS, it would be more tool-like because you have different races and, you know, resources on the maps and stuff like that. And those can be quantified as tools because, you know, say, for example, Zerg requiring X many expansions. They usually need an expansion more than their opponent. So what kind of tools do you have in terms of the terrain to actually take that extra expansion? What does it cost you? So on and so forth. Those are all really large subject. There's a reason why, you know, the mapping for Brood War was so heavily contested a lot during time, or win rate percentage changes of even 1 or 2% were scrutinized heavily. And, you know, the various matches in certain maps sometimes were favored for certain races just as a result of just the terrain being different before we even really start thinking about like individual units. But in terms of like the players' assets, I think of terrain and stuff as a. Let's see, how do I quantify that? So, I guess it's best just to start from the top. It's hard to really approach it from any given angle except from the top. So, let me just bring up my window here. All right, there we go. So, I made a post. I don't usually, like I said, I'm not really whole big on the game design document thing. Sometimes I write out some concepts, and then those concepts usually end up changing in actual implementation. And everything I'm about to talk about is the same thing. This is like the ideas. But those ideas have been formulated over playing dozens of action RPGs. Now, what is an action RPG? I'm thinking like Devil May Cry and its American ripoff God of War, the really shitty Nier Automata, you know, the shitty Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, Kingdom Hearts. All these games all share the same thing, which they have like some kind of customization, but they're not RPGs. There's no real role playing or customization. But they're action games as well. But most often with a lot of these games, like including DMC, is that you find that they don't really have action. And they're not really role-playing games. So the action RPG genre has these third-person action games, most of which aren't very good. Now, DMC 1 was basically going to be Resident Evil before it became Devil May Cry. So a lot of the ways in which it behaves that have transcended down all these other games are as a result of that Resident Evil heritage. Now, I'm not familiar with Resident Evil. I have played Resident Evil 5, and it was hilariously bad.
Yes.
That's actually when I first discovered CTS and arthritis.
Yeah, that'll.
Press square to punch a fucking boulder. That's
Yeah, that game will do it to you.
That. To be honest, that to me just like that says a lot about these kinds of games. So Resident Evil 5. That's your more. That might be what more of our audience thinks is more of your typical third-person action game. You run over with the over-the-shoulder camera and stuff like that. It was really, really bad to play on co-op on that CRT TV. It was like a 20-inch CRT TV. It was hard to see anything. The alligators were a big problem, and the final boss area was a disaster. Now, the problem with a lot of these games, including DMC1, actually pretty much all the DMCs, is that you get the fixed camera. So the fixed camera, it's worth bringing this up right before we even talk about stuff like player control and stuff like that. Because a lot of these games use a fixed camera. God of War, since it was just a DMC ripoff where they took out gameplay and added in QuickTime events instead, it's very, very heavy on that quick way to just yank away your camera at every opportunity. Not just like, the dumb stuff like in-game cinematics or whatever, they're constantly taking away your control. But also just the arenas and stuff. So Prince of Persia as well, the console one's a big issue. PS2 Plus. I haven't played those. They're on my LP list. I know there was earlier, I think like NES, SNES, Prince of Persia. They're probably a lot different. But yeah, so the camera. So the camera is a tool. And when StarCraft 2 was announced, a lot of people asked the question, is the camera going to be able to zoom out more? Because they didn't understand that the camera in StarCraft was a very, 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 core, low-level, fundamental manner in which the game was played. So at the opposing end of the spectrum, you have Supreme Commander, which you can zoom all the way out to minimap. The minimap is just basically the same thing. And Supreme Commander feels horrible to play. It's very, very detached and very, very horrible to play. And a good chunk of that is just due to the fact it's really clunky. It's it's powered by Lua, so in general it's just unresponsive and really slow. But the way in which it was designed is unresponsive and very slow. And the camera plays a really big part in that. When we think about something like an RTS, or a mod for an RTS, or a campaign for an RTS, we really shouldn't just stop at the point where we start thinking about custom units. We got to think about how we're going to handle how the player actually interacts. Now, like Pornogo said, my current project right now, since I have switched off of StarCraft 2 and decided to commit wholly to Unreal 4, is an actual game. So I am starting largely from scratch. I do have a bunch of assets I'm ripping, and I'm remastering and doing whatever, and I have the assets I've made, like the FumeFX textures and voice acting and sounds and stuff like that. But to be quite fair with you, I haven't even put in most of this stuff yet. I haven't even tried to. Sounds and stuff like that are the furthest thing off of my list, and I might try voice acting maybe next year. Because what I'm trying to figure out right now is those core low-level things. But it's not like I ignored those things within stuff like StarCraft, because those are how you process information. How you distribute information to the player, how you present information to the player, that's a tool. The camera is a tool. The camera is something the player is always interacting with. Now, when we think about player tools, like tech trees and macro and units and stuff like that, we're all interacting with these things through the lens of user experience, UX, and the camera plays a part of that. And one of the things about macro maps and large maps and stuff like that is it requires you to make more use of your camera. And you will find, now I'm bringing this up for a very specific reason. I'm not just talking about the camera for no reason at all. This is actually, the reason why I'm going to bring this up is because when a lot of people ask these questions, why doesn't StarCraft 2 have a camera you can zoom out more? And Blizzard cited for the gameplay experience. They weren't very good at explaining themselves, but they did have the right idea down. StarCraft, Brood War, is a game that fundamentally requires you to pay attention. It has things that you could conceive as being archaic, like no multi, build select, and no auto mining. But the fact of the matter is that in this game, you have to actually pay attention to what's going on in multiple places of the map you can't see. So one of the primary skill expressions of StarCraft is keeping track of stuff that are not within your peripheral vision, that are not within your ability to actually see. Now, StarCraft does give you notices all the time, but when you're sitting at 200, 300 APM, you probably don't even have those notices on because they're useless anyways. What you really have going on in your head is lots of different threads of thought. My structure is about to finish, I need to start making workers. Or my expansion finished, I need to Maynard workers over there. Or the workers I've already Maynarded over there because I predicted my expansion about to finish have reached there, I need to actually get them to mine now. Or I've got these units that are waiting for these lurkers to unburrow, I've got to move them, and then I gotta flip back to base. And then, build some, siege tanks and marines and stuff like that. And then we gotta flip back to our main army. Now, you've got hotkeys helping you, but a good chunk of this actually physically requires you to move your camera around. And this is skill expression. Now, there is a line between what constitutes as a tool and what constitutes as a gimmick or a chore. Now, typically speaking, this line is drawn in stuff that you actually physically interact with that have actual, major implications. So, Blizzard in StarCraft 2 introduced a lot of things that automate and remove skill expression. Multi-building select, smart harvesting and stuff like that. And the command centers even tell you how many workers you need. You actually don't even need to do research in one of the most important parts of the game anymore. It just flat out tells you. And this is all intentionally to remove skill expression. Intentionally to remove skill expression, because there is one thing that Blizzard hates above all else. That is player skill expression. They despise that. They hate it. And every single one of their games, they do all they can to get rid of it or homogenize it as much as possible. Because Blizzard isn't really catering to gamers. They aren't really catering to these people who really try to improve a lot. One of the things you would see in the upper echelon of Korean gameplay back in Brood War's heyday was the skill gap between even what would be considered a mediocre player who is, just infinitely leaps and bounds ahead of the top American players, incomparably speaking. But there's still that huge gap between him and the top end players. One of the things you'll notice is that when these people end up fighting in the tournaments, usually in the lower brackets when it first starts, that skill gap largely comes out from the ability to multitask and really keep control of the map. You'll have players like Jae Dong or Flash who end up running circles around these people because they can keep so much going on at once. There's that one, I don't remember the matchup or what year it was, but there's probably a lot of these infamous games where Flash has 4 or 5 drop ships across the map, all doing their own separate drops at the same time. Now, anybody can do that in StarCraft 2 because, well, it's so much easier to do so. All the other stuff you otherwise need to be babysitting at the same time, you don't need to babysit. So Blizzard instead, because a lot of people expressed concerns about the skill ceiling being dropped so much, they introduced what are called macro mechanics. Now, a macro mechanic is something that has an arbitrary timer and does the one thing. But you have to use it to get the most out of your power budget for that race. So one of the things I'll probably visit a lot within podcasts like this one is the concept of power budget. It's especially something you're going to see a lot within an RTS, but it's really applicable to any kind of game where a player invests something, such as time or an actual in-game resource like energy or health or whatever, into getting something in return. So within StarCraft 2, each race has a power budget that's represented by their macro mechanic, as Blizzard calls it. This is Blizzard's wording, not mine, because it is a gimmick. For example, inject larva. Inject larva is something you absolutely must use on cooldown every single time you can. Because if you don't, you get less larva. And if you get less larva, you get less units. It is absolutely imperative you use that in Creep Tumor over and over and over and over and over and over again. Because your race is balanced on an Excel sheet that says you need these numbers to defeat these numbers on average. If you don't use these things, you put yourself at a disadvantage. But this is the big thing. Let's take a step back and look at Brood War and the resource harvesting and stuff like that. In a game of Brood War, you can have 2 mediocre D-rank players or 2 really godlike S-rank players. And both of them are going to be interacting with the concept of harvesting resources and expending resources in the exact same way as each other, no matter the skill level. What the skill level determines is how well they do it. Meanwhile, in StarCraft 2, anybody can use a button on cooldown. Anybody. Yes, it takes a lot of skill to actually remember to use it on cooldown, but it's non-interactive. The second you push a button, it's just fire and forget. And like Chrono Boost and stuff like that, it's just fire and forget. That's it. And it doesn't have a real impact. It's just changing a few numbers. But you need them in order to actually win. You need mules. You need Chrono Trigger. You need Inject Larva. They need to exist because you've been balanced around them. Whereas in Brood War, every single element of you building the expansion and then actually harvesting resources from it and protecting it and stuff like that, down to you choosing when and where, that is a part of the game. So when you say tools, I think of what the player does to express themselves. Anything that the player actually directly interacts with that physically exists in the game world that expresses itself through that interaction. Mechanics like larva injection and buffs like attack speed or whatever, they do not contribute to this because they are fire and forget. They once you've used them, you no longer interact with them at all. So as an inherent concept, I despise things like cooldowns, for example. Diablo 2 went to shit the moment they introduced cooldowns to the game. That was it. That was the defining moment that Diablo 2 became garbage. And it was because their servers couldn't handle it and their game couldn't handle it. So they thought, let's put cooldowns in everything. And then the game got a lot shittier. And it became a lot less interactive. So when we think about my game, for example, that's coming off of DMC and stuff like that, it was a conversation in the gay channel that made me want to open with this statement, where there is some random nobodies trying to make a StarCraft 2 map or something that automates the process of economy. It automates your workers or whatever.
Yes, this is the Vanguard prototype, as for people who want to look it up for more context.
And they are calling this an RTS, where they are literally removing the economy from the game.
Yeah.
Congratulations, you've turned what is a shitty RTS into an even shittier RTT. And people wonder why nobody plays RTSs anymore. It's because of shit like this. Yeah. It's exactly the same thing as the macro mechanics.
Yeah, well, the reasoning was totally off anyway. They were just talking about how, like, oh yeah, the reason why we're going to automate this is because any player, who wants to play the game should be able to play the game at a decent enough level.
But anybody can play the game.
Yeah, I know.
Look at StarCraft 1. There's still really, really shitty people playing that game. And they know their shit, and they don't care their shit. They still play it. They still enjoy it. This is why things like macro mechanics and things like automated worker harvesting is bad. You do not pad the experience for people who do not want to improve or can't improve. You give them the avenue to improve in a manner in which scales up as they get better. The worker system in StarCraft 1, and vast majority of other RTSs that are like it, is very, very simple. It's so basic, anybody can understand it. It's simple, and it works. Changing the economy system in StarCraft and things like it requires a colossal amount of research that some random programmer in his basement is not going to get without spending years and years and years actually researching StarCraft, and these guys didn't because their reasoning is absolutely completely demolished just by the sales figures alone of Brood War, much less the fact that it continues to endure to this day. There's a reason why it endures. It's not the same people playing it today as back in 2009. It's new generations of players keep coming in because there's no alternative.
Yeah.
Which means that when you look at making an RTS, you always go back to Brood War. You ignore every other example until you understand Brood War. And if you don't understand Brood War, you don't do anything because you're not going to do better. Brood War was the way it was. It instigated this whole stupid esports fad for a very, very good reason because it was well designed. It was a fluke, but it was well designed, and it's something you need to research. And even when it comes to these stuff like the ARPG and stuff like that, I always look back to Brood War. Every single time. No matter the genre, I go back to Brood War. So like I was saying, the camera, DMC, and stuff like that. Fixed camera. This is because of performance. They can't afford to model the entire scene or whatever. So they have the camera in one spot, which means your controls are relative to that one spot. And in a lot of these games, switching between those cameras is really jarring and fucks with your controls. So that's glorious. So within my RPG, I immediately thought, okay, so we're going to have a follow camera. And that's going to be it. Never fixed camera. And you can control it. So control-wise, it's probably going to play very, very similar to Final Fantasy XIV in terms of how you move and how the camera moves with you. So the camera is driving your positioning. Now, I'm going to be honest. I have not actually played that many games like this. The closest would be Black Desert Online, which I did not play a lot of. So I'm really walking into unknown territory with this. But the other thing is, with all these ARPGs, they're all console ports, right? So they're all coming off of control sticks, which means their controls are really stupid to begin with. A lot of them use something called lock-on. Now we're going to get into real player tools. So Dark Souls is trivialized by lock-on. When you lock onto something, you can move around while always facing them at full speed. And especially in the earlier Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls, a lot of enemies really don't do much to punish that, actually. I played the vast majority of Demon Souls without lock-on and using a spear. And the second I realized how stupid lock-on actually was towards the end, it made the game very trivial.
Yeah, it really puts it into perspective. All the struggles you had were because you were opting into an inferior way to play the game as opposed to the game.
Because I had been trained to avoid lock-on because God of War doesn't have lock-on. I played that before this. And in God of War, it was really about your directional accuracy. So I had approached Demon Souls really ignoring lock-on because I don't like playing that. Because for one, lock-on changes your control scheme completely. It's very jarring to switch on and off. I still have problems with that, even in my item randomizer run for Dark Souls 3, where I actually fall off ledges several times just because I switch in and out of lock-on. It's very, very jarring, very ugly, very, very unintuitive. But a lot of these games are built on lock-on. And what lock-on does is it usually even changes what you can do. So in Alice Madness Returns, you can only block while you are in lock-on. And it's very, very, very clunky. It is the worst part of that entire game as far as controls are concerned. Very, very, very clunky. So you have to use it to defeat certain enemies' defenses until you get the hammer, I believe. So it was like one of the worst things in the entire game, and it was a chore. Because you did not have access to blocking outside of lock-on. You could not block. And it was there exclusively to deflect projectiles and break enemy armor, because that's a creative concept. And this is in stark contrast to the first Alice, which was like a really, really untested Half-Life 1 mod, but I think it was actually using the Quake engine, and it managed to perform worse than any other piece of software I've ever used on any computer, except for the Blizzard launcher, actually. It brought my computer to a crawl all the time.
Impressive competition, name dropping the Blizzard launcher for that game.
The Blizzard launcher is it's horrendous. It's even using a Ryzen 7, it's not fast. It is not fast at all.
So when you bring up the fact that lock-on completely changes the way that you interact with the game and the way that you interact with enemies, one of the first things that made me think of in another kind of genre was aiming down sights in FPS games. And like it's the same reaction that you have where you're like, I don't like playing with lock-on. I hate playing with ADS. I feel like it's just an accuracy hack while also obviously slowing your movement speed usually, or there's usually a drawback. Some games there isn't, but for me it just feels so bad to have to completely change the way that I'm inputting and moving around and see like my view as well, seeing the battlefield. I much prefer games like in Counter-Strike where that is completely restricted to a few kinds of weapons, and I also prefer other games that don't have it at all, because to me iron sights and that sort of thing, while I understand some people find it more immersive, just completely is ridiculous to me in the sense that it feels much worse than just being able to move around freely and have your enemies also challenge you with their movement. And, having to keep up with them accuracy-wise, and then you just make the guns accurate from the get-go.
I actually faced something. It's a good thing you bring that up, because this is actually something I saw on my design table right now. So in a lot of these games, you get ranged weapons, but they're really, really gimped. And why are they gimped? because of things like in DMC2, where once you get the rocket launcher, you can just hold down the roll button and the rocket launcher button, and the game plays itself. You can go through the entire game doing nothing but shooting things with rockets because they have full range, they deal splash damage, they do a lot of damage, and enemies are just not aggressive enough to close distance with you. Or you have shit like in Darksiders, where they basically make the gun just for specific gimmicks and otherwise useless because it does no damage, and it has a super long reload. So all these games, whenever you get ranged combat, it tends to be garbage. Or in God of War, for example, you do get a bow, but it's based on your mana. So it shreds your mana, which you don't regenerate. And you need that mana for buttons, otherwise, for spells. Because, yeah, plus you have to upgrade the bow on top of it. So
yeah, it just winds up feeling like an
bow?
extra system on top of everything else, but it was like half-baked. They threw it in there just for the sake of having ranged instead of like actually working it in.
The bow is incredibly bad. And DMC3 found that they nerfed a lot of the ranged weapons, but there is actually very strong ranged combat in there. You can animation cancel the guitar. The rocket launcher is still pretty good if you use, I forget what it's called, the gunslinger and stuff like that. There is some good DMD ranged videos out there. But in general, they definitely took a step back in that title and nerfed a lot of the ranged weapons. And then we come down to DMC4, where I honestly don't remember too much about that. I think Lucifer was good. But DMC4 was just such an easy brain-dead game with a bunch of shitty telegraphic fights in it. Except for Dante, who is very broken. very, very cheesy and very broken. But so I'm looking at my RPG, and I'm thinking, am I going to have ranged combat in this? Because I would like to have ranged combat, but I also don't have lock-on. I'm also not allowing you to pivot up or down, mostly because of my asset restrictions. So when it comes to things like verticality, I'm expecting you to use jump attacks and AoEs and stuff like that. But at the same time, I would like to give you ranged combat because I want to put in a bow that is using a power shot like in Terra that slows you down and charges up, and the longer you hold it, the more damage it does. And the reason I want to give you this is because I wanted to give you something that deals a very, very large amount of spike damage, and you can use when you have a range advantage or you've stunned an enemy. So it's important to note that for my ARPG, I am changing a lot in terms of the accepted standards for these games. For example, the accepted standards for a lot of these games is to have annoying shit like hit lag, time slowing down, weapon trail, stuff like that. All that's gone. I'm not introducing anything like that at all. An enemy might have a time stop spell, but that's really as close as you're gonna get. But so this bow, you do not have any of the typical things that you would abuse certain charge up abilities on, because enemies are way more aggressive in this. If I had the ability to show you a video, I'd give you a really quick example. But basically, my very first test enemy I'm starting to set up now, it acquires you, it runs up to you, it starts swinging at you. It swings at you about once every half second. And that is basically my baseline for enemy aggression. Now, they're going to do more stuff when I've fixed them up, like teleport around and shoot ranged attacks and avoid you and stuff like that. But the general gist of things I want is that enemies will not have hard stalls in them, like in every other game where they kind of mill around and do nothing. They're always going to be doing something. Now, they might be doing an idle animation or some kind of charge up or something to give you the opportunity to move around, but the enemies are going to be moving around a lot more. But I wanted to give you a ranged attack. And at the same time, I wanted to do something normal ranged attacks because I didn't want you just, like, there's a lot of considerations that have gone into the control mechanisms, too much to cite really all at once. But right now, the big thing I'm contesting is, how do I want to handle actually aiming this? We're not going to be using lock-on because it's stupid. We want the player to actually physically have to aim this thing. And it's going to restrict your movement because you are charging it with basically going to be a great bow. And you will have multiple stages of charge. And that will also be based on animation cancels. So one of the things I'm doing in this is I'm not having combos like all these ARPGs like DMC and stuff like that are basically based off of fighting games. And you have input combos. Now, they're not often, usually, not as sophisticated as half diagonal, A, B, C, and then, full rotation, 360, or fucking Tager's inputs or whatever. They're usually comparatively very simple, but there is combos in there. Mine are not. I have no elaborate combos like that. If there's combos, they're all timing based. So your base attack, if you attack again at the end of your animation, you will initiate a second unique attack to that one and initiate a combo based on timing. And then I'm going to have cancels. So if you looked at high-level gameplay for any of these games, you're going to find that people find ways to cancel stuff and either do things faster, get out of animations, basically do really unintended stuff and get more power out of their power budget. This is going to happen no matter what you do. It's just like micromanagement in StarCraft. People who get comfortable with a game are going to find ways to do micromanagement and get more out of something than you think they would just by numbers alone, like attack moving vultures, patrol moving corsairs, stuff like that. People are going to figure this stuff out and it's going to happen. So rather than try to find ways to get around this, I'm embracing it. I'm building canceling into the system. So one of the base examples I have with this great bow is the great bow charges up lightning to attack. You have two lightning abilities. One is melee and one is ranged. The great bow is your ranged one. And my goal is that I want you to be able to cancel out of these slower attacks once you've reached the charge up point and put that lightning damage into another attack that has different properties to it. And there'll be some advantage to doing this. Like, say, for example, you could put it into a broad sweep and hit a wider area, do less base damage, but apply the stagger effect. That's another thing I'm exposing in this is stagger and stun. So within all these ARPGs, typically if you get hit, you're stunned. And that's it. Dark Souls changed that up by adding in poise, which is not explained to the player in any shape or fashion. Within my game, you deal 2 kinds of damage, maybe 3 if I decide to have a chip health system in it. I don't know, but right now it's just 2. Health and stagger. You and enemies follow the same rules. Just enemies will have different kinds of stagger and different health bars. And basically, when you hit something, you deal both a base damage and a stagger damage. Some of your abilities are going to do more stagger damage than they do health damage. Some are going to do more health damage than they do stagger damage. Some will do mixed. Whatever the case is, you hit an enemy, they take stagger damage and health damage. When you deplete their stagger, they will become susceptible to some kind of hit recovery, depending on the attack. There will be small hit recovery that may interrupt some kinds of attacks, and then there's actual stuns, which are going to be way slower than the stun, or way faster than the stuns you see in like Dark Souls and stuff. You aren't going to be stunned for like 2 or 3 seconds. And then some attacks, like the lightning attack, which is basically based off of Olaf's E. That's thematically what I'm going for, is something that hits really hard in a very precise area. That will be your strongest stagger attack. So what you will want to do for a lot of these smaller enemies is you want to poke them and then move in to actually attack them when you have a way to control their aggression. Which brings us into player tools, is controlling how you CC enemies. So one of the things you're going to see within all these games is they're all based on CC. They're all based on crowd control. They're all based on taking away control away from your player, your opponent, or you. If you watch a fighting game like BlazBlue, the core philosophy of the game is to get the enemy into hit recovery so you can combo them. After you've got them into hit recovery, it becomes a quick time event. And that quick time event is how well of a combo are you going to put in. A lot of the skill that comes from games like BlazBlue comes down to knowing when and where you can get that hit in that will throw them into hit recovery, and then into combos. Into whether you're doing a 3-hit combo at low level or a 20-30 hit combo at high level or whatever, how long you can keep them under crowd control so they can't fight back. Upon which case, the opponent may as well set down their controller and start drinking vodka or something, because they can't do anything anyways, unless they use a burst to break your combo, but that's a really long cooldown. If you heard that, yes, people are getting shot behind me right now.
Oh, okay.
But in ARPGs, this is even worse because they don't have control systems like this. In BlazBlue, you have different kinds of wake up. You have the burst and other stuff like that. But all fighting games are basically the same. That descends down to the ARPG, where basically you just stun lock shit to death. DMC is very bad for this. You just stun lock everything to death. Now, in the higher difficulties of DMC3, they do have something kind of like the stagger bar thing, apparently. I haven't really looked into it yet. But you can break enemy and stagger and then CC them with a 3rd hit on your base attack or some shit like that. But the net of it is that a lot of the time you're just basically wailing at enemies that have walls of health and are not fighting back.
Yeah, well, you were talking about the whole input, or not input delay, but just the idle delays that are built into their animations, basically. And I think it's really weird that developers would even come up with that as an idea. Because to me, it's like you're programming in just incompetence to your enemies. Mm-hmm. Like, it goes back to what we were talking about when we discussed how everything is writing on that episode of the podcast, and we talked about how enemies, the way that they behave in game, completely is what mainly controls the player's perception of those enemies and how competent they are. And so if you're literally programming incompetence into them, you're making it so that you are gimping them by design, then of course by design you're also making it so that they can't be taken seriously. So it's certainly not necessarily something that surprises me that you're not going that approach, but it is nice to hear, because again, the alternative is looking at all these games that do go that route, and as such we can't take any of them seriously. One of the things you mentioned earlier on, one of the things that you mentioned early on is movement-based abilities for the enemies, them teleporting around and trying to sort of mitigate how much access that the player actually has to them. So is there a particular example of mechanics that like the player themselves has? Like, is it possible, for example, for the players to theoretically unlock the same set of moves or whatever as any particular enemy, and it's just down to how the player wants to specialize? Or are these moves going to be unique to certain enemies and the player just has to adapt to them when they find them?
So the player has their own set of movement abilities. It is based in large part on DMC. You will have the dash, and then you'll have something like Trickster as well. And when you're in the air, you also will get double jump, and you can air dash and Trickster dash as well. So from the get-go, I wanted this to be a very high mobility game in which the player can move around very, very quickly and change position a lot. Especially since we're not going to have stuff like lock-on, and we are using a follow camera instead of a fixed camera. We are avoiding all of the major limitations that would make systems like this either super, super broken or really awkward to actually play. So I'm looking for something in which the player can navigate levels extremely fast. So these enemies will be able to teleport away from you and towards you. But you can close distances with them quite quickly. You'll be able to navigate complex geometry a lot faster than the AI will be able to, because no matter how aggressive I make the AI, they're not going to be able to navigate these levels as fast as a good player. It's just about making them as aggressive as possible, giving them the tools that they can to succeed. But fighting these enemies in particular is going to require the player anticipating their attacks and their moves and stuff like that. So you'll be able to attack freely and prepare an attack for them when they jump into you. And say, for example, you could swing and turn or some stuff like that. There's basically you're looking to create setup. Terrain as well. So one thing that is also a player tool that you do not typically get within ARPGs is terrain. Because one thing you're going to find is that right off on the bat with DMC1, these games restrict your arenas when you fight enemies. You always get sealed into a room, typically with very little, if any, access to Z levels, because no enemies in any of these games navigate Z except for DMC1. In DMC1, a couple of enemies can actually jump up ledges. But one thing you're going to find all the way up to DMC5 in present day, enemies cannot navigate ledges. And this is not some arcane science. It was actually the second thing I implemented in my AI, is the ability for them to jump over ledges, onto rooftops, and under and over bridges to get to the player. That is working perfectly 100% in my project right as we speak. And these multi-billion-dollar companies can't put that in their game because they just don't know how, or they don't care. So we had lots of stuff like in DMC5 where I'm killing these mini-bosses with impunity by shooting them with a very, very shitty damage pistol from a ledge. And I just do that incessantly every chance I get because I find that hysterical. I find it hysterical in these games that enemies can never navigate ledges. It is one of the most basic, dumb fucking brain-dead shit you would implement in day one of creating your AI, just like I did. And nobody does it. Nobody does it. So what this ends up happening for the player is that when you get stuck into these little arenas, it's all about reducing player creativity. It's all because the developer is just too fucking lazy to actually make their enemies do something like navigate the level, chase down the player, or retreat to regenerate health, or any of the other innumerable things you would do in a, say for example, let's take a look at Quake or Unreal Tournament. So in Quake and Unreal Tournament and arena shooters, the arena is not Bloodbath. It has features. There's pickups and hallways and open rooms and corridors and lots of sort of like danger areas, points of interest, and stuff like that. But when we enter games like DMC and God of War, suddenly those don't exist anymore. I mean, pickups and stuff like that don't exist anymore anyways, but terrain features cease existing. They just don't exist anymore. And you can't create them for yourself because the developer doesn't want you to think. Again, it's about removing player expression in the most simple, fundamental way possible. What are you going to do in a big open area when you're surrounded by archers? Well, you're going to find a corridor or someplace you can shield yourself from them. But they say, nope, you can't do that because we're going to seal this door, we're going to spawn a mist wall, we're going to spawn fire, whatever the fuck, and you can't leave this room now. You're stuck in here with everyone. And then this also doubles its grind because you can't ignore the enemies. You have to kill them to open the door or whatever. So, like in an objective-based map, like say, for example, navigate to this place, you're basically forced to fight every single fight on top of it. So it's a double win for the developer. They don't have to work on making the game actually challenging and, respond to a player that thinks. And they don't have to think about level design either because they can just force you to go through time gates instead. DMC 5 was very, very bad for that. Very, very bad for that because none of the fights were challenging at all.
Yeah, so one of the immediate corollaries I can think of is like in any of these shitty FPS games that are really, really linear and really set-piece driven, you have turret sections or some sort of on-rails section where the player can only do certain things. And then there's set pieces along the way of enemies that respond in very pre-scripted manners that are very wooden, that don't really have a lot of flexibility, we'll say. And I guess like in an RTS context, it would be like if you were stuck in a defense mission and now you can only do X, Y, or Z for 30 minutes instead of actually playing an RTS. So you'll notice it's not just that we're taking the mechanics and we're saying, these mechanics are changing. It's also, the AI enemies are completely different and respond in very scripted manners. Like it's simplifying a bunch of shit on the development side. It is requires a lot more testing, fine tuning of certain things because you need to make sure that your linear thing progresses in a acceptable fashion, I suppose. But beyond actually making sure that your linear set piece stuff works, it's way less overhead than deciding I want to make an AI that actually threatens the player in any capacity or a group of units or something. So yeah, for sure it's not a very enjoyable experience at the end of the day, and yet people oftentimes defend this stuff just as it's a change of pace or it's any of the other silly things that we've heard down the years.
Yeah, so I think of terrain as a tool because let's take maybe I can get some screenshots or something. Let's take my test map for example. So I don't have enemy damage in it. It's not a good example for combat, but I do have the enemies that run up to you and attack, and you do damage to them, and you can kill them and stuff like that. And the whole purpose of this level right now is to test how well does the enemy navigate. Now, they don't navigate very well because at the moment they only chase me when they have line of sight of me. So I haven't implemented this system where like they've lost line of sight, now they're going to pursue where they last saw you or something like that. One of the reasons why I haven't implemented that because I'm actually having a really hard time finding good training examples to go off of for AI. Because a lot of people, they don't use the engine's Blackboard system for AI, which is basically, this is the same system that a lot of games have. It's just Unreal works a little bit differently, but it's still the basic fundamental example. It's basically a behavior tree, and you do things in sequences and stuff like that based on conditions. A lot of people instead bake their AI into the actual unit blueprints themselves. And they hard code in like their targets and locations and stuff like that and things like that, which is just, to me, just screams less flexible. And I never want to do that. I want to do everything through the actual system intended for AIs because I can then use all these different stuff I've made for the AI through them through the years on and just makes a match between them instead of it being hard baked to actual individual character classes. And one thing I've found that I was actually really surprised by is, despite the fact I don't have this this pathing very well set up right now, when the AI sees me in a corridor, they will happily path over to me. They'll run right up to me, right through all these tight-ass corridors, and with equal proficiency as they do on the bridge or out in the open. So there's none of the issues of the AI getting hitched on walls or stuff like that. So I can think, wow, okay, so I've got this big level, and right now I have it set up so that they can follow me onto the rooftops, they can follow me into the hallways, They jump up there on their own accord when their random pathing sees it there. I currently in my current implementation, I do have to place nodes that they see the links between the jumpable areas, but I can just place millions of those. Later down the line, if I ever actually do manage to learn C++ and stuff like that, I can actually go into this source and make my own pathing system that uses a different variation of A star or whatever it's called. And there's a thing I read about it where you can set it up so they can actually see these unpathable locations between areas as locations to use jump in more dynamically. So that's like an end game goal. But the short of it, the short of it is that I don't want to have to restrict you to an arena. The whole map is your arena. So if you don't want to fight them in the open, you can try to bait them into fighting you in a hallway. And then they will have tools to respond. So it's all about setting things up for interaction. This is something you'll hear me return to over and over and over and over and over and over and over again in every single one of these casts, is interaction concepts. I want this to be more about you deciding how to interact with enemies and enemies deciding how to interact with you. In the vast majority of these ARPGs and stuff like them, enemies are extremely simple. They can do one, maybe two, maybe tops three things. And bosses may have different appearances and stuff to their attacks, but they still ultimately amount to the same thing. For example, the vast majority of the bosses in Dark Souls 3 amount to you using a quick time event, which is your rolls, versus timed swings that are huge and sweeping and otherwise impossible to avoid. It's basically Simon Says. And the other thing you'll notice about a lot of these games is enemies get very special rules when they suddenly become uninterruptible, or they can't be hit recovered at all, or they do special things to you that you otherwise have never seen or never exposed to you in any certain way. So the teleportation thing, for example, is a special ability, but it's not going to be anything really unexpected or out of the ordinary, because you also have super high mobility. And
it'll be on a lot of enemies, presumably. Like,
yeah.
You said that the first enemy that you implemented, which is presumably going to be fairly common, at least in the early levels, is going to have this. So, like, players will expect it, basically. Oh, did you numlock?
Did I?
Oh, there you are.
Hi. So yeah, players are going to right off the bat see this very high intensity unit that does all kinds of different things, and then we set the standard.
Yeah, it's like the bunker rush of enemies.
So what I want them to do and think about that point is, okay, so what's going to happen next? So now they start thinking. And then they might start thinking about how they can deal with this stuff. So I was thinking about player tools. So I'm sitting on something which is going to be using predominantly a mouse and keyboard. I didn't want to be confined by the same rules that we had with all these console-based games. And I talked a lot with a guy who's learning how to play DMC at a high level and did a lot of research into the subject and stuff like that. And we basically concluded that it's better just to use the camera-driven movement that we see in like Black Desert Online and some Star Wars games, and go from there. So I also wanted your character to be a little bit different than the other characters that you play in these games, where sometimes you like switch weapon types, or you swap stuff in and out. Like you can swap Rebellion for an axe in the SJW DMC, or the fist weapon Cerberus in DMC3 or stuff like that, and changes your moveset and stuff like that. I'm not going to have weapon swapping in this. The Great Bow is actually going to be an ability you just use. So I'm using something that's sort of ability driven, not in the same sense as like League of Legends where you use an ability that costs mana and has a cooldown, but ability driven in that a lot of your moveset is assigned to individual hotkeys. And what those abilities actually do is going to be dependent a lot on cancels. So again, I haven't really figured out a lot of specifics that can really get into details a lot yet, but something like you push, let's say G to use your Great Bow, it puts you in aiming mode. That's something I haven't decided on, is how I'm going to let you aim this. I think I'm going to go for an over the shoulder, and I'm not going to give you a crosshair. You're going to have to learn how to aim it on your own. And I might have a base Great Bow shot that's like an artillery that splits that you also have to aim on your own. But it really depends on, like, when I make my implementation, how does it feel to actually play? I go a lot based on feeling rather than by textbook. If it feels good to play, then I work on that. If it doesn't feel good, then I change it. And I tend to have a pretty strong sense of what feels good to play. And when we go from there, we look, I forgot what I was talking about. Yes, they have weapons. So you actually dual wield in this. You've got a main hand and an offhand, and I have been searching for a day and a half for a good offhand model to rep and port, but I haven't found much success. But your main hand is basically like a broadsword, and your offhand, I'm hoping to make it a polearm or a spear or something. So in your base combo, these weapons will deal the same damage. But outside of the base combo, and even during the base combo, a lot of their properties are actually very different. And different abilities use different weapons. But each weapon is actually physically going to be different. Your offhand is usually going to do a little less damage, but have more reach and range to it. And that is the weapon that is typically used in longer ranged attacks. Now, it's important because a lot of your attacks actually mix the two weapons. So even if you miss your main hand, you might actually still hit with your offhand. Now, there's a few other major changes with these weapons in that because the collision and stuff and the properties are going to be very different, when you see certain animations with these weapons, you're going to expect different behavior out of them. So your offhand is traditionally going to be the weapon that you don't use a lot while moving. So your moveset will change while moving. It's going to be very similar to Black Desert Online, which is very positionally and movement dependent on what actually changes. But I didn't want to make it feel like Black Desert, where it felt like you were completely screwed when you were moving, except for using some very specific abilities depending on your class, a lot of which were dependent on cooldowns. So when I sat down yesterday, I think it was yesterday morning, and I set up player damage for the enemies. And I was looking at like, okay, so I want my enemies to be able to do damage to my player. Now, suddenly this level is going to become way more lethal when I do that. And it's going to be harder to test it while I have this up because the player only has the base attack right now, which is just a basic melee combo. And I thought, okay, so this is a good opportunity to think about what do I want to actually be able to play myself? Because this is a game for myself. I might let other people play it. So what do I think I would benefit from in a moveset that doesn't actually fuck the balance up? And I thought, okay, so I don't like the fact you can use your strongest, what's supposed to be your strongest base damage combo while moving and standing. I thought it's kind of silly to be waving around both your weapons while running around, especially since currently I don't have a system in that slows you down when you go backwards. I don't have the backpedaling. It's just basically full radial movement like in DMC or God of War or whatever. I'm probably going to change that so that you actually have to orient your camera around. But I don't know how to do that stuff yet, so I haven't gotten to that point to see is this a positive change or not. But Final Fantasy XIV does it that way, and it feels all right to play, but that's not an action RPG. So I go through this kind of process every single time I think about something. Okay, so I want the player to be able to attack while moving. I'm not want to remove their ability to attack while moving just because it's strong. I can use this as an opportunity to give you a different attack while moving that's also strong in its own way. So I gave, currently it's just a thrust attack with your main hand, just one attack. And I thought about it along the way, and this is why I don't write stuff down, because I come up with ideas along the way, and I thought, okay, so currently I track where you are in with your main base combo. And I have to do it that way so I know which attack comes next. Now I have a condition that sets when you are moving past a certain speed, you use this thrust attack instead of your main combo entirely. And I thought, wouldn't it be kind of neat if you could mix and match the two just by moving around? So I said, okay, so when we use a thrust attack, we're going to fix ourselves in the first stage of the base combo. So if I am moving and I use this thrust attack and I stop moving, I now will use the two faster sub-swings of the main combo instead of having no combo and not using the base attack. Now, what I can do later down the line is change the stagger ratios of each of these attacks. What I want is your movement attack to have more stagger damage and less base damage. So currently it just does less base damage. So I can circle my enemies and poke them, but it's not as good damage as standing still and actually fully committing to an attack. So that feels natural. You would think you want to be, more grounded on your feet and more steady and using both of your weapons and more accurate to actually make the full use of your abilities. But nothing, explicitly says you can't swing your sword around while you're walking. So that both made sense from a gameplay perspective, and it feels fairly fluid to play, at least against enemies that currently don't actually do anything besides swing when they're near you. They don't even face me yet. But I can tell just by the fact that they do swing so fast that, if they did actually have active damage right now, I would be taking a lot of damage very quickly by standing still. So when I get my stagger system in, you can say, okay, so poke them. stagger them, and then full commit, and there you go. That's just your basic, CC setup. But the stagger works so differently in this that you have to really pay attention to what you're doing, because you have to commit to enemies to really stagger them. And that makes sense. So now my next thing I implement will probably be the groundwork for what will be the strong stagger attack, the slow heavy attack. We get in those bases of your normal attack, your fast, and then your heavy, and then we go from there and think about options. So when I think about options, I think about decision making. I think about, why would the player want to have a new ability? I think about the desire behind why would we want this. And I think about it from the perspective of, how does this influence our current toolkit? So let's take a step back and look at StarCraft again. You've got Marines, Zerglings, and Zealots. Each is strong in its own manner, and both seem to fulfill the exact same role of your Tier 1 basic unit, but they're all very different, and they're used very different throughout the game. Zerglings are cheap and not necessarily efficient, but efficient enough at being, melee units and attacking. Whereas Zealots are, in many cases, a lot of people complain about Zealots because you get that +1 and they just 2-hit Zerglings and that's it. And then you have Marines, which in the hands of a skilled player can kill basically anything in the game. And they're ranged on top of it. And they have Stimpaks and they can be healed. So they're also really strong. But when you think of them individually in this manner, you think that Marines are the best, because they can do so much. They may not have the raw stats of the Zealots or be quite as cheap as the Zergling, and you can't get as many of them as you can Zerglings or whatever. But they are there as, something that is universally useful, just because they're ranged, they can move fast, they can attack area units and all this other stuff. They just universally seem better. So you might think, okay, so now how do we balance this out between them? But you can't. You have to think of it as the full fucking tool set. The thing about power budget is you look at potentials. When you balance something, you look at the potentials of what it offers you. You look at the potentials of what it can do. So the Marine is the most efficient and most effective because he can do so much. He's basically the multi-role fighter. But at the same time, just like real-world multi-role fighters, which are in large part failures in the grand scheme of things, the Marine doesn't really fare that well on his own, or even with healing, against many of the other options the races have. Like, say, for example, Lurkers. Unless you're a boxer, you're going to have a hard time against Lurkers with Marines. And siege tanks also are a problem. And Irradiate's a problem in some cases. I mean, it'll instantly kill a Marine, so they can't... Well, I guess you can heal out of it, but it's going to deplete all of your mana. You actually lose power budget for healing a Marine through Irradiate. And, things like Ultralisks don't really take that much damage. Battlecruisers will chew through them. Archon, Psystorm, stuff like that. So when we start thinking about all the other options, massing Marines against Protoss is not something people do for very good reasons, because Psystorm, Ravers, and stuff like that will just tear them apart. That doesn't mean that Marines are absolutely useless suddenly. It just means that now we've considered the options and the tools that everybody else has. The Marines fit into their own slots. They have their own designation, their own dignification, their own identity. So when I start adding attacks to my player's moveset in this ARPG, I have in my mind a few things I want to add. I want that heavy attack, the Olaf E, that's characterized by that lightning strike, a lot of damage, a very high stagger in a very, very small AoE that enemies are going to normally try to avoid when they see you using it. I want the Great Bow, which is your ranged version of that that's even harder to use but has way more reward. It's basically your highest risk, highest reward, and maybe the artillery shot if I can figure out how to make it work. I have your base attack, which I characterize as being fairly slow, but your highest overall damage ability that you want to use when you can, because it will basically, the later ends of the combo will have multi-hit attacks in it that will overall deal the highest damage of your set. So I don't want you always feeling like you have to cancel out of this into something else. I want it to actually be useful and worth investing into or canceling into in specific opportunities. And then I think, okay, so now I want to give the player an option for some kind of AoE, broader sweep or something to hit around them. And then I want them to be able to add damage onto the end of their dash, like Stinger and DMC, but something they opt into in case they don't want to use it, which will be another cancel, and that will come out of your offhand, so it'll have really long reach. So then I divided my abilities into things that I feel like are attacks you have to commit to, like the Great Bow and the Olaf E, and base attacks, which is like your primary and your pokes. And pokes are where you're going to be trying to deal some stagger damage or keep stagger broken on the means that you've already broken but are trying to avoid, and stuff like that. And you can poke while moving with your main hand, or you can commit to a poke with your offhand, which is harder to use, so you won't be able to use that while moving, traditionally speaking. So now I have actually a pretty strong idea of a moveset already, and I can do a lot of different attacks and interactions based on your cancels. If you cancel out of your heavy attack into your AoE, maybe now you've committed a lot of time and energy to that AoE, so now your AoE will be stronger or something like that. The properties can change, stuff can change. And at the end of the day, I no longer need to have to worry about having input combos where you know, do full 360 rotation up and down, back and left, ABC to use your big explosive moves, because I have given every one of your base abilities a fair amount of identity and strength on their own. My enemies aren't going to be so tanky. You're going to be sitting there hitting them for like 5 minutes. You're not going to feel like you need to have, you know, these huge inputs. And you're already performing combos just by canceling and decision making on your own what you want, because each ability is going to have its own identity. As opposed to stuff like God of War, where it's like, I need to CC enemies and that's it. Like, if you CC them, it doesn't matter how you do it, you just keep doing it. Like, the triple heavy attack is a really good example, because you can redirect that last swing, and that's got the longest reach and the highest damage. You can very, very safely poke in and out with it on a lot of enemies in that game, all throughout that entire series, actually. Anytime that attack appears, you can abuse it to fuck all throughout it. I just abused it endlessly. And then you have your fast AoE, that is basically the same thing without the damage. And you just basically use those mindlessly, because there really isn't much point in using anything else. Because there isn't. There's just no dynamic to any of it, because you either CC them or you don't. So those are the player tools. And then from then on, I just think about decision making. I think less about, okay, what does the player have in terms of buttons they can push, and more about what can the player do. Because doing involves things more than just pushing buttons. And this, again, all this stuff is so interchangeable. It brings us right back to discussion about writing and AI and stuff like that, because you're going to find I always return to the same questions of how does this engage the player and how does it engage your opponents. When we start talking about the AI making its own decisions and having its own tools and trying to make use of those tools and trying to at least, you know, superficially outsmart you and being aggressive and stuff like that, then it really comes down to the interaction between you and your enemy, and less about you doing something and then the enemy just being, you know, some numbers that are on the side or whatever. Like, say, for example, in the average RPG or MMO where you're farming stuff, enemies are just basically drop percentages. Like in Black Desert Online, none of the enemies in that game do fucking anything. I have a video on that. This game has the most sophisticated combat system of any MMO you will ever see. It is basically the pinnacle of what Asia has managed to do with the non-tab targeting action game. And the enemies approach and swing or spawn damage, and that's it. They literally do nothing. They literally do nothing. So your success in that game is basically determined by the tens of thousands of kills an hour. That's what you're looking at, because none of the actual content that you're engaging with means anything. It all comes down to your QuickTime event that you make, which is your rotation, where you use the abilities to get the most amount of kills in, you know, how fast you are in navigating the area and moving around, if your class has the AoE necessary to do it, or whatever. There is absolutely no actual thinking involved once you've got your rotation down. It's just mindlessly smashing stuff and hoping for drops, and that's it. And this is a game which has it has really high latency in it, so the PvP is pretty garbage. But the combat engine and the basis of it is actually really, really, really strong. It's really hard for me to get used to because I'm so used to these console control schemes, but its control scheme is actually pretty strong. But the actual gameplay that surrounds it is meaningless. Like, we go to like DMC, you go to God of War, any of these games, a lot of them have a lot of weaknesses like quick time events or whatever. But at the end of the day, you are using a fighting game system and you're interacting with something that is a grind system. the enemies don't interact with you. Like, all of DMC5's bosses are horrible. 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 There is one of the end bosses. I literally just sit in the air and stab him without even, like, paying attention to what's even going on the screen. There was a lot of bosses I just one-shotted with Dante outright, having no idea what I was doing, because they couldn't handle me just sitting in the air attacking them. And I'm not a good player by any stretch of the imagination, and this is the highest difficulty that I had access to on start, and these guys aren't even attacking me half the time. They're like shooting lasers and stuff below me. I'm just sitting in the air pushing attack and killing them and not caring. And then we go into Virgil, which was a really, really shitty design as well. So Virgil was the one dual fight that had the potential to be good, but they really goofed him up a lot in 5 compared to 3. 3, when you think of good ARPG boss designs and stuff like that, you think of Virgil. Not necessarily because Virgil's really well designed, but because he stands out as being one of the few times you're actually playing like a fighting game, like what its whole systems were intended to be used for. But he still has a lot of special rules and stuff. He can still break out of your CC. Basically, you can only hit him so many times after he attacks. Well, in DMC5, that's coupled with a lot of him walking around doing nothing. Like, they slow down the fight a lot. And there's many points he's basically invulnerable and just flying around doing nothing, and you're just waiting. So, yeah, they fucked that up pretty bad.
Yeah.
But your movesets and stuff like that are pretty fast, and you can attack really fast, but a lot of the times the enemies just don't do anything. Until, basically, what ends up happening is, a lot of the times I take damage in this game is because I stop paying attention because there's nothing actually going on. I'm just mashing inputs. And eventually, an uninterruptible enemy or an enemy off screen hits me. But I've lost attention because it's so fucking boring and nothing's happening.
Right.
That was the same kind of problem I had a lot in Kingdom Hearts 2, where a lot of off-screen damage happened, or enemies were like impossible to raid, or they're uninterruptible, or whatever. So there's like a disconnect, a really big disconnect, because they didn't think of it from engagement.
Right. Well, I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, where an engaged player is doing more than just pushing buttons mindlessly, waiting for enemies to die or health to go down or some other, essentially a Simon Says call and response type thing.
Yeah. So what I take away, it's like I said, this is such a big thing that it's hard to really break into it. But when you say like the tool sets of the player,
right,
I think about how the player engages. I don't think about any single thing. I think about, like, the camera is how the player reads information. That's a tool, because what my enemies are doing, if I decide to adopt a camera system just like Black Desert Online, what that means is that you actually have to physically turn your character to face behind you to see what's going on. You can't just flick your camera back and forth unless you're out of combat. And in which I might even change that. Like, I haven't decided this yet, but Like that's one thing. Like, what that means is that to actually look behind you is actually going to be a conscious decision, something you actually physically do. Because I might have you take bonus stagger damage from attacks that are behind you if you're not paying attention, because audio cues are going to be a big thing in this. We don't have audio in games like StarCraft 2 or Diablo 3 or whatever, because they don't have audio design. So audio cues don't exist. I'm dialing back. I'm going back to the games of yore, where audio cues actually were really important. Because a lot of people, including myself, they actually read audio cues before they read visual cues. So the soundscape's going to be really important. I want you to be paying attention to stuff that's behind you because you heard it, that it was behind you. So when it comes down to your camera, the camera is going to be a tool. How you control your camera is going to be very, very important. For the very same reason that StarCraft 1's camera is very important. And, the very same reason why Supreme Commander is an objectively inferior game than StarCraft, because they decided to take the camera out of the equation. Because they decided, we don't want the players to have to worry about the camera. Here, just look at everything. They consciously, in a sense, it makes sense from a certain logistical standpoint that the player can see everything that's going on. But from the gameplay sense, there is such a thing as giving the player too much power, like infinite resources, not having to worry about consequences, not having to worry about economy. Power expression also comes with responsibility, and I don't think I really talked about that before.
No.
I'm actually going to grab some coffee really quick.
Sure.
So if you wanted to add on to that, I can talk about the responsibility stuff later, because that's really important. So I'll be back in just a moment.
Okay, so you were talking about, well, obviously we were all talking about a number of things, but you were just broaching the subject of responsibility as far as what the player actually has. And I think in a nutshell, before we get into that, because there's a couple of things I wanted to respond to from before, one of the probably the most important aspects of that is when you give the player something and they didn't earn it, right? Because you're giving it to them. Say, like, handing them a bunch of resources just for them walking into an area in StarCraft 2. That happens all the time. Or any other number of silly, ridiculous things where you just get free things, right? Or almost free, basically free. You didn't earn them in the same way that you would if you mined those resources yourself or, got that... I like to think of it like power-ups in Doom 2016 could be another example, because they're never in positions where it's difficult to get to or requires some sort of skill. And
I was really surprised by that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, even on a theoretical basis, imagine if the power-ups existed as a way for players who are not mechanically gifted when it comes to shooting to still find a way to find success if they were really good at movement.
MSS shooters.
Yeah, well, no kidding. But if you could say that, if you're really good at movement, you can go and grab the power-ups before the enemies destroy them or before they expire or any number of other things, you could, have some skill expression for players who were not necessarily as great at handling the enemies face-to-face, but, they could offset that with something like that. I don't know if it would work, but just that's an example of how you could work that in. Unearned power is certainly something that... I think completely disengages. It's actively toxic to the experience of engagement or of the attempt to engage a player, because if they didn't earn it, they have no sort of, feeling of responsibility, feeling of self-preservation when it comes to those assets. I think of it in an RTS context. You remember in the Antioch Chronicles 3, we were playing a mission that seemed like a very, like Babby's first RTS map, and then just a bunch of units spawned in with a cutscene, and you're handed like 50 supply, and you wipe the map with them, in addition to whatever units you had built up beforehand. And so, like, the reason why, at least in my case, I'm always very, very quick to just throw those against a wall and have them suicide is because I didn't earn them. I didn't train them myself. I have no attachment to them. And so that's another thing that can happen for players, is that it's not just that they may, maybe they don't feel like they've earned the asset. It's also that they have no sort of attachment to them. It's the same thing as, like, if you get free tickets to some sort of event, well, you didn't spend money. There was no investment into that. So maybe you are just not going to go there. And so breakage is much more common with that compared to, if people actually bought the ticket. Recently, I actually saw... It is worth
noting right here that you are approaching upon one of the most powerful psychological weapons that are used to lock people into stuff like phone games.
Oh, absolutely.
And stuff like World of Warcraft and stuff like that is daily logins and daily quests and stuff like that.
Right, because I've logged in X amount of times in the past month, so why would I stop now? I've invested all this time, I've invested however much money, and like we talked about that in the Hong Kong episode of how as soon as you start spending money on a mobile game, the first time you do it is the hardest time, and once they breach that, it's all over, it's all downhill from there. So yeah, I mean it's definitely a very big psychological topic, just the idea that a player who hasn't earned a certain thing, has been given something for free, has been given something without the, sort of, what's the term? Like, the asset that they have now in their hands was earned with a very minimal effort. Like, the effort does not correlate to the power of the whatever asset they actually just came into contact with. So that's an example of that. I did want to point out, though, that earlier, about an hour into the podcast, you touched on what I think is, again, pretty important. It's what I echoed your sentiment earlier, that a player who is just pushing buttons, that's not what makes engagement. A player who's just mindlessly, mashing inputs is not going to be engaged. And it all comes down to, how you're going to handle giving them more power, giving them more tools to use to get that power themselves, to earn that power. Based on the whole wider picture. So you talked about how if you're going to balance something, you want to make sure that you're balancing it not in accordance with just one small interaction, where Marines losing out to Zealots in most cases, or something like that, or Zerglings being able to swarm them, especially with the speed upgrade, and suddenly you have to do a lot more APM with your Marines to keep them alive versus Zerglings than the Zerg player has to, because the Zerg player just A moves, stuff like that. So obviously, in that case, if Blizzard took that approach for balancing, which some may say that they did for StarCraft 2, the balance would be completely out of fucking whack. But if you consider the whole thing, if you consider not just all of the racial things, like all of the units and upgrades and whatnot that each race has, but also the mechanics of the game, how the camera works, how the selection limit works, how all of these other things, the pathfinding, all this other stuff, how the spellcasting works. When you consider the whole thing holistically, and it is admittedly very challenging to do so, you have to constantly remind yourself to be cognizant of that stuff. When you do that, I think you come away with a much more complete picture in general, and you're able to make more informed decisions when it comes to balancing and tweaking balance, and just even understanding, like, from a player perspective, not even from a developer perspective, but if you understand, the more you understand about a game, the more you understand about the bigger picture of that game and how the moving parts interact with one another, the better equipped you are as a player to handle certain things and adapt quicker. And so I think you'll actually find that most developers are really bad at their own games because of the fact that they don't understand them at a foundational level, nor do they understand them at a global level, like completely zoomed out, taking everything into account, the Supreme Commander view, as it were. And so if you can't look at that as a developer, then odds are you're only going to be good for as long as it takes players who are new to your game to adapt. And those players who actually give a shit about understanding everything, say in League of Legends, for example, where the fucking founder of the company had to get his account boosted, like, this shit is just insane. And so you can tell that they don't understand. I mean, the Riot development team, for the balance team behind League, is a really good example of people who don't understand what they're doing. StarCraft 2's balance team, they don't understand the game at a global level.
One of the things between Blizzard and Riot is they both hate people. They hate people that know their games better than them. They're very, very spiteful against, like, people developing their own meta and stuff like that. They have to fuck with that all the time.
It's very common for them to just make decisions. Like recently, actually, I guess it was a couple of months ago, Overwatch actually received an update that locked your roles. So you can only have 2 of any given role, because people were running like 5 tank comps. Or 4 tank comps or something. I don't remember. I think it's called GOATs, because GOAT.
They also locked your. You can't have same hero teams anymore.
Oh, okay, either. Yeah, all right.
As well, that was an older change, but they just hate fun.
Well, it's a thing. It's like that guy who there was some scandal back in the day for League, like a couple years back, where some guy was playing Singed support. He had a really high win rate. He clearly understood this pocket pick.
I remember that.
and he was punished. I don't know. I think he was banned. I think he was just.
He had like a huge win rate, but people complained he wasn't playing a support champion, and they're like, "Okay, banned."
That was really funny too, because I think that was the same year people were picking Zyra and doing massive damage, and so like, it was really funny. Like, people were doing that at the highest level of competition, so it's kind of funny to think that shit like that can work. Like Misfortune support, people playing fucking Misfortune, and they go like full AD. It's what the fuck?
Why made a lot of people angry? Because we played a ranked team, and we would run like bruiser bottom lanes, like Riven Jace and shit. And
that's all the rage now too, apparently, from what I've seen.
Angry.
Yeah,
and then like that would be bannable.
It's just so schizophrenic that they went from you're like enforcing, basically holding up disciplinary action on this guy who was like rank banned or something for a while just because he played a pocket pick, to now the entire fucking meta is like Yasuo, like Garen support or shit. Like, what the fuck is happening, man? Like, what is going on? So I don't know the exact matchups. Obviously, I haven't played the game in years.
My most successful support I had in ranked and non-ranked was Rengar.
Yeah, reasonable. I've legends of the Rengar and Gangplank support still haunt me to this day. I remember doing.
This was way back too. This is years ago when it was like unthinkable. Like, Rengar wasn't even really that strong,
right?
But Shadowflower would play him in support, and it would just work.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is like, another example of that for people who know League anyway is when Tom Kench was released, good old Tony Kench. We had like Fiora Tony bot lane. Patrick was playing Tony and just eating people, and I was just annihilating them. And so like people would see this role, people would see this lane, and maybe part of it was the fact that they had no idea how to play against it, and they just assumed that we were trolling. But when we annihilated them, there was a lot of butt mad about that. A lot of people get very angry when you destroy them, not just in general, but also with a pick that they think is illegitimate in some way. So
Heimerdinger's support was also in there too, because his turret, so many people would dive. He'd drop his turret, and they would die.
Yeah. Well,
and they would get very mad.
Of course. And that's the thing is, like, it goes back to our conversation about balancing globally. It's like these people understand that there's more to the game than even just the numbers. There's also the psychological component. There's the knowledge base of their enemies. There's people find success by abusing pocket picks. And finding certain like niche things, like I would play fucking like attack speed fizz jungle and shit and just annihilate people, because like that stuff is people underestimate the power budget, they underestimate how it works, they haven't played against it enough. Even if it's somebody that they've seen play it before, they still are not necessarily going to fully grasp the extent of that champion in that role because they just don't understand it. It would be like, you know, a very wacky build order where somebody rushes queens in StarCraft. Like maybe that will actually work in some context because people aren't going to expect it. They've never seen this before. Or in Counter-Strike recently at the most recent major championship, we had two of the top teams going head to head, and one of the teams, Team Liquid, had 100% win rate on a certain map that had just been added to the pool. And then the other team, Astralis, who had been their rivals for a while, and Team Liquid had absolutely destroyed going into this tournament for like 3-4 months straight. Astralis actually picked it themselves and had counter-stratted them specifically. So like this is an example where the numbers don't even bear out that they would have a victory. Like the idea that they would pick this map where Team Liquid has 100% win rate on is insane. But it's the same ideas because they prepared a strategy, because they understood the game at a higher level. And they were able to find some way to find success even in this area where statistically they are not favored. Just like statistically, the Marine is not favored against Zerglings. But people can find ways to make that work on a micro sense. And it doesn't even necessarily mean it's imbalanced if they can't find success, because that's just one element of the game. It's not the entire picture. So this is kind of common sense to most people probably listening to this, but it's very shocking how many developers, big and small, wind up omitting this sort of thing from their mantra when it comes to actually designing their tech trees, their tools, the mechanics of the game, and how they all fit together. There's many, many different things, like even the presence of macro mechanics in StarCraft 2 to begin with, that belie a very insane amount of ignorance on behalf of the developers. I don't think that the developers knew for a second what was going on. I mean, of course, then we have interviews where 3 High Templar are making Archons, so we know they have no idea what the fuck they were talking about. But it's very telling when shit like that happens, and when you see that as a player, I think, you know, maybe you don't notice it when you're going there first. Maybe you don't notice it when you first hear these silly developer interviews, or you just see these balance changes and you feel the brunt of them when you're trying to play. But I think subconsciously people will figure out that these are, you know, certain balance changes. They're certainly not all created equal, we'll say. And so hopefully developers listening to this can understand maybe a way to balance a bit better, and with a more of the complete picture in mind. And players can understand that, you know, basically how to see the good changes compared to the bad ones, and how to diversify them in that sense, how to stratify them across what is intelligent, what is born from a more complete understanding of the game than otherwise, and when it's just born of ignorance. So I don't know if you have anything to add in particular.
Riot's approach to stuff like that and Blizzard's approach to stuff like that is just so fucking bad. Like, okay, let's say there's something really unintentional being used that you don't want to be used because it completely breaks the game, but the very fundamentals of these games that they're fucking around with, like removing build orders, removing the early game from StarCraft 2, banning champions in certain lanes, it just hints at a complete and total disconnect and a spitefulness from the developers. It's like, you're successful, but you're not playing the game the way I like. Even though the game is about making decisions. Fuck you, Leatherman.
Yeah, imagine a strategy game, a game that purports to have a huge amount of strategy to it, and may very well have a huge amount of strategy to it, saying, sorry, that strategy is not allowed. No. Like, that strategy is a bannable offense. Just so insane.
They just did that in StarCraft 2. They just removed the whole early game. They were like, we don't like this, so bye.
Right. Well, yeah, in that case, it's like, it's even more insane, I think, in some ways, and of course less insane than others, because it's not being as hypocritical as Riot or Blizzard with Overwatch or anything like this, where they're actually instituting a rule where you're punished or they change the mechanic after
really
launch.
Dumb,
but it is definitely,
excuses are so bad.
Yeah, it is definitely very, very suspect.
In every single one of those cases, the excuses are so fucking shallow. All they do is just drive people away from their game.
Right. Well, that's what happened with me with League. Eventually, I just couldn't handle it. I think that's the same for everybody I've talked to about that. Of course, it's more than just them making balanced decisions. It's also just the new champions that they released, which I guess are balanced decisions in and of themselves, having a certain amount of mobility creep, and yeah, exactly. So
utility creep is a great thing to add to this too, because I was talking about like responsibility and stuff.
Right. Well, right before we get into that, I'll write that down so I don't forget it. But I also wanted to hammer you on something you mentioned earlier, where your AIs are making decisions and they're being aggressive or defensive or expressing certain play styles. This is something that I always talk about, especially on my mod streams. But we've talked about this mostly to death, I would say, on the podcast. At the very least, we've talked about it at length. And one of the ideas that I wanted to run by you is I actually came up with a similar sort of decision-making tree system to what you were describing, but for an RTS view, where the AI would consider certain targets and certain AI's playstyles would sort of lead biases in their target selection. So this would also be based entirely on map knowledge. And the idea is that if the player, in this case the AI, has scouted an enemy's set of production structures, they say they see 10 gateways, then that is considered a target. And they bias towards that target by saying, all right, how far away is that? And a more advanced AI might say, like, what is the danger of me taking these paths to this area? But also, how valuable is it? So is it 10 gateways or is it 1 gateway? Is it, when I was in this base, did I see 20 probes or 2 probes? When I was seeing this tech area, scouting this area out, did I see 5 armories or 1 armory? All this other stuff that will change how the AI handles and sort of conceives of the value that the enemy would have. And then they'll also bias towards the targets based on what their playstyle is. Some of them may want to harass your economy. Some of them may want to just break your army. They'll specifically search out for your army and find out where they're the weakest and try to attack them from that angle. Some of them would assess and say, all right, their production is here. Let's destroy this first because this is what I want to do. I want to deny them the ability to respond and macro cycle out and cripple them that way. And so it's basically just the same thing as what a player would want to do. The player will decide, do I want to cripple their economy so that they can't build more units, or do I want to cripple their production so they can't build more units, or do I want to just kill their units that they have now and then take more shit on the map and then push forward and just try to rinse and repeat? There's a number of different play styles that players obviously use. And so I try to come up with various strategies that you would see in an RTS game, like a high-level StarCraft game, as strategies that would be useful, would bring you closer to victory if they were successful, and then find a way to have AI handle that stuff instead of sort of pseudo-randomly as it does now with the built-in system, or me having to hard code every single thing in. You can't hard code stuff like this in because players will build wherever, and other AIs will build wherever as well. So it's pretty much impossible to even figure that out. But so we have to do it algorithmically. We have to do it sort of, again, like a threat grid almost, like figuring out this is what assets are here that we last saw. This is this far away from my base. This is poses this much amount of a threat. Like a more defensive AI may try to just move its units closer to where it sees your army, try to preventative measures for when it thinks that you're massing for attack. Or a proactive AI that sees your army near its base may prioritize that over any other target because they want to try to attack you before you're actually ready to move out, potentially. So there's like a couple of different things. Obviously, it's very difficult to try to get into all of them, but I feel like this is a good example of what an RTS corollary would be to a duel in an ARPG, where there's 2 opponents or however many opponents in a battlefield, and they're fighting and making use of all of their different mechanics. In an RTS context, it's using certain units and certain abilities and handling certain behaviors and taking advantage of terrain. And the terrain thing is, of course, also true in the ARPG sense, depending on how the battle is actually taking place. Like you gave the example of trying to hide away from ranged units, try to bring them and lure them into more advantageous areas for you, or fighting them out in the open where there's a little bit more unpredictability, or maybe not unpredictability, but a little bit more overhead for you as a player to make decisions. So I wasn't sure what you thought of that, but I feel like that's a pretty good basis and a decent corollary as an RTS example of what I've seen from your commentary on the Dark Souls 3 duels and stuff, the Virgil fights and all that shit.
Yeah. That's actually very similar to the AI concept I wrote out for StarCraft 2 back when it was in alpha. is one of the project concepts I had blocked out was a custom AI project, and I thought, so what do I want to do with AI just besides making it better? Well, I wanted to have a personality system, something that influenced not simply their build orders, but how they actually attack you, when they attack you, where they attack you, and stuff like that. That is actually something I do plan to put into the ARPG as well once I learn more about the AI and how be more comfortable with it. There's a lot of ways I can, like, say, for example, I can initialize, when I initialize this unit, I could run a randomizer that selects a profile, and that profile alters some variables that can be used for distancing and checks and certain actions and certain decision-making weights that determines if it's going to be more aggressive or more, passive, or how it reacts to certain events. Like, one of the things I want some of these units to do is that when you are low on stagger, they will actually be more aggressive. So the Void Hound normally might like try to teleport away and heal if you are looking strong and it's looking weak. But if you are looking weak and it's looking weak, it'll just go all in and just try to finish you off. But even that behavior could be modified by an overarching personality system that makes each one of them behave kind of differently. Where they might even be really evasive and just hang out at a distance, at a long distance, until you get into a fight with something else, and then they'll engage you. So there's changes like that I can make where it's even based on your perception. Like, if they hear you, they'll try to move to places where you are not, or if they don't hear you, you could possibly get the jump on them and things of that nature. I'm sure it's possible, just judging by what I've seen and looked at so far. It's just a matter of figuring out how. But that to me is like one of the first things I think about, because in order for your opponent to have a personality, you have to define a personality, and the personality can be defined by how they act, but also when and where they act. And when you have a framework like that, like let's say, for example, we have these enemies that run up and attack me. So they're all perceived as being just aggressive. So now if we have one that doesn't just run up and attack me and waits until either I'm attacking something else or my back is turned to it, now we have created the distinction. Now there's a distinction between two of the same thing, which is the same as the RTS, where you have two Terran players, but one goes mech, one goes bio. And it's also a distinction between the two Terran players, where one who chooses to take expansions and one who chooses to be very early on aggressive, doing things like dropping planetary fortresses in your base, for example. Or we can have other distinctions where one of the player drops bio on you and tries to doom drop you with Marines, or another person tries to drop tanks on your expansions incessantly and control your macro. So we look at a whole bunch of different extremes between several very, very similar polarities, and each of them still ends up becoming distinctive just because of the decisions they make behind it. But the kinds of things are typically reserved for player versus player interactions. Bringing it into AI versus player interactions is going to be largely successful depending on how well you're actually able to make the AI do this. So I think it'll be very interesting to see in StarCraft, because it's certainly something I have not seen. I know it's possible. I mean, I have AIs that would do certain waypoints or doom drop or whatever, but
right, run past the enemy's defenses to hit their workers or something like that.
Yeah, they would drop transports on you and just not give two fucks, or they try to navigate around you all dynamically. But it was pretty flaky because it was natives we didn't really understand, we couldn't really do a lot with. But to actually see it fully done will be certainly interesting, because it's something I've wanted to see for a very, very long time. It's something I've talked about for a long time about wanting to do, but the resources didn't really exist. So I'm presuming that since you're talking about it, you have a solution to actually make this happen.
Yeah, so, I mean, on a technical level, I'm not as savvy as the man, the myth himself from the Ukraine, Iquare, but what I do have is a document where I wrote out basically how the AI would be biased towards these things. And so basically in the AI script itself, the same way where you would do start town and attack at and all this other stuff, you'd at the beginning as a header command, and this would be modifiable at any point in the script should you want to change gears and do a tech switch or something, a priority switch or something like that. You would actually tell it to, AI attack bias or something like that, and it would then say, you'd put a parameter in and then a number of a percentage chance or something like that. And then if you wanted to override that for a specific attack, say you specifically request 12 Mutalisks for a Zerg AI, and you obviously don't want them to go full frontal or attack their army per se, you might want to just harass workers specifically with that. You could then do AI attack target, mining or economy or whatever the keyword ends up being. And I think we'll have a lot of flexibility with stuff like this because eventually we're going to be developing a brand new system for writing this AI stuff. We won't even be needing the well, you used ASC3, now I use PyAI, but we won't even really be using that tool eventually because it's too limited with you can't have an arbitrary number of parameters or arguments in your commands. You have to. It's always like you must put in attack add quantity unit ID. You can't do like a quantity unit ID and then a conditional.
Isn't there a source available for that?
Well, I think for ASC3 there might be. PyAI is no. All right. Well, PyAI is open source. I tried to get it.
But he would not give me it. I wanted to update the fucking help file, and he's like, "Lol, no." All this fucking Camelot system people are the fucking same. They're all useless fucks.
Well, that's the thing is like they were just first on the scene. They wrote some buggy ass tool, and then
they held onto it with an iron grip, and it held us back for probably about a decade and a half.
Yeah. So
it's insane when you think about it.
Well, it's the same deal with right now. I do have a bone or two to pick with fucking suicidal insanity. I know he's a busy guy. Obviously, I'm not begrudging him his time, but the thing is, like, he seems very reticent to release the open source for SEM Draft, and it's such an important, powerful tool that I don't know if he's just self-conscious about his code because a lot of it is probably built on old shit. But that's not really that big of a deal. Like, we have somebody who's willing to learn whatever needs to be learned in order to fix stuff. And hell, I would fucking do that if I thought for a second I would be able to, actually do it. But unfortunately, without the source code, we don't actually have access to improve these tools. We have to write new ones from scratch. Shit like Firegraft made by Disciple of a Dune before he decided to go rape somebody. Just like these people are completely
Is that true?
lunatics.
Does he really do that?
Yeah, apparently so. That's what I've been told
was
by
there proof
multiple
posted somewhere?
Well, multiple sources told me it, and I don't think that they had really talked to each other either. So, like, one of them was Excalibur, if you know him. He was mentioning that apparently he tried to come back. Disciple of a Doom tried to come back during the remastered days when remastered was announced, and Excalibur specifically said, like, dude, you're not allowed in here. You fucking raped people, idiot. So it's like, yeah. I mean, again, I haven't seen any evidence, but no reason to discount those individuals.
That's really weird coming from, because that was a guy I worked with.
Oh, okay.
He made for me the limit expander and stuff like that, and he made for me the 110 Firegraft stuff like that. So I talked to him, not a lot. I didn't really know him, but it's weird.
It's like that Killer 11 thing. It's just like surreal to find out like what the fuck these people did after you worked with them, or before, or whatever.
It's strange. Well,
their hidden lives.
I think I never thought about it at the time, but then I realized later that he literally actually did just like abduct someone.
Yeah, it's fucked up.
It's kind of weird, but no, I've just is fucking weird.
Right.
I think the only sane person to come out of Camelot Systems was Skywing, who I think does security or was doing security for Microsoft. Who knows now with Pajit and Command, but
yeah. Well, the bottom line is on the technical side for this, basically, that's what it would look like. And since we're going to be using a new scripting program, essentially, a new tool to handle this, I'm not sure exactly how that will work because we haven't really talked about that yet. But as we're going to be using a new tool, I am definitely going to be specifically like requesting certain features for this kind of thing. Like we're all Ichor is going to be writing his own AI for his own projects as well, so it's not just a tool dev. He's got a vested interest in making sure that this shit is usable, which is like one of the weird things that I always find with these tool devs is they don't actually end up working on anything. Like maybe they have some weird aspirations like Poiquart for the Python modding suite. He says that he wants to make stuff eventually. Nave says he wants to make stuff eventually.
It never happens, right?
But as of yet, I haven't heard anything like that, and they just maintain the tools. But it's very clear when you find a tool dev who's made a tool for themselves to use, like it's much different. It's much different experience than when you're using a tool that was designed for other people to use because they don't use it, so they can't actually comment on the UX, how functional it is. Just the fact that we have like PyTile issues that were fixed in 30 seconds with some dude walking in and looking at it. Like Vic just walked in and said, oh, this is overflowing because there's too many tiles being cached. I'll just disable this and then test that and see if it works. And yeah, it fixed it. It was great. So it's like the idea that it's just going to crash when you're scrolling around. Like the thing is like it's always these bugs that are like if you use this tool for longer than 30 seconds, you would find these issues. So like these people just don't use them at all. And so thanks for making them, but seriously, like I feel like you talk about player responsibility, which we have yet to get into, but talk about fucking developer responsibility for your tools. Like, come on, man, what the fuck?
Yeah, that's kind of unsettling. I think
Yeah.
I would have yelled at some people if I ran into that myself.
Yeah. So that's just some of a look inside the fucking insane asylum that is starred.net and everybody associated with it. So whatever. But yeah,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, just looking at it from the perspective of developer, again, it's sort of the same argument actually. Is like, you want a tool dev who is using his tools to make stuff. Well, you want a developer who's making a game he wants to play, right? So it's like the same
Yeah.
idea. So because I want to see an AI just like you want to see this AI in action, I want to see this sort of system in place and see how it changes and morphs the experience. Because a lot of the problems with AI is that like we can't have multiple attacks running at the same time. So like one of the things that I wanted to do was get a system that would make the AI actually split their army. So that would be like instead of like it's not just attack targets, but it's also attack styles. So you might do full frontal. You might just go right in and find like the easiest way, like the widest path, and then just send all of your army there. So this will also modify the grouping. You might want to split your army and attack the same target. You might want to split your army and attack multiple targets. So this is like Doom dropping 5 different expansions as Terran. Like that's what an AI personality that I want to give Raynor and his merry men and all of those people, because I really think that it'll be interesting to see like multiple raider type AIs that are just doom dropping you and trying to like sort of work together to be greater than the sum of their parts in that sense and defeat you, who's theoretically like you and your Zerg allies in the campaign are going to be more favored to win against some fucking paramilitary group that just happens to be in the same area. But the idea is that they don't win with numbers, they win with strategy, and they win by just constantly needling you and harassing you and finding shit like that. And that's a very different experience than fighting against the Confederates or the Dominion or whoever else who are also Terrans, who also have access to similar or if not the identical tech, yet they engage you in completely different ways. Currently, like it would be a very scrap cobbled solution to try to make that right now, which is one of the reasons why I think this new system is very, very important. And because we can have splitting attacks, we can have air only attacks or some sort of special attack where they try to use terrain to their advantage. They specifically, they're not just dropping on your base, but they're dropping at cliffs near your base and setting up tanks or, positioning air units over those and microing them back and forth. Like we're going to have a kite micro system where they'll be able to stagger and move back. And all this other shit. Like, certainly a concern is I don't want to APM caps. I think those are retarded, but I'm not really sure how best to balance the supposed APM of an AI player in this context. So that's going to be a challenge, but I do think that it's something that after a while it'll feel good to play against, and you'll actually have to express some sort of skill to defeat them, and it won't feel unfair because the AI just never gets tired and it turns into a grind. That's my main concern, but I also think that like that's just something that will get resolved over time, just like what you were talking about.
Well, having AI allies will help that.
Mm-hmm, yeah, that's true. And all of these maps are going to be pretty large scale, so like even the first map of all of these campaigns end up being 3v3s, which is the first Zerg mission is a 3v2v1, so it's more of an FFA. But most of these maps all have 6 players. All 3 of them have 6 players, and there's all these larger team battles, and like these are the first maps of each campaign. So like you get a pretty strong message very early on that this is not your average tiny fucking 64 by 64 map campaign or whatever. So yeah, I mean it's gonna be cool to see for sure, and it's definitely a work in progress, but I figured since you were talking about AI decision making and the personalities that are imported into the AI, it made sense to bring it up because it was a more recent development, something that I came up with yesterday. And so I feel like it's a pretty strong idea. I definitely think that it'll be interesting to see where, how it gets expressed. But it's like, you want to have the AI sort of use all of its assets. Like this was born from the concept that what I wanted to do was I wanted to have some sort of algorithmic thing that I would still have some control over on a per AI script basis, a per personality basis, but would basically loop through all of their production structures that were idle or would soon to be idle, and then add those to sort of a group that would then be used for producing units for attacks. For like an attack that was soon to be in the request log or was actively in the request log. And if we can do all of that, then maybe we give them sort of specifications for the attack. This is an attack with lots of melee fighters. This is an attack with lots of ranged striders. This is an attack with lots of air units. And it just uses the instead of specifically requesting like 9 scouts and 12 zealots or whatever, it does it on a more like how many production structures do I have to commit to this, and gives it a more flexible timer as well, where it says, attack in, try to attack as close as possible to 1 minute from this attack being added, something like that. Like you get a lot more flexibility, I think, out of a system like that, and it will still feel like victorious and important when you're killing their production, right? It adds more weight to it because right now the AI just overbuilds a lot of production and then doesn't spend their money and they float it. And so that's another concern is if we can manage to make it so that the AI is smarter about using their units, and they are using all of their production structures to the, as much as their economy can support, suddenly we can reduce or remove the AI, the income multiplier that we have. And I feel like that'll be a nice step if that ends up being something that we can do, because then we can't argue at all that the AI is ever cheating beyond just not getting tired, I guess. So that was another consideration, is trying to level the playing field even further. But so that's that.
I'm going to grab some more coffee. I'm actually going to feed the cat really quick. You're just recording right now, right?
Yeah, I can pause it if you're going to get out.
Okay, I'm going to go AFK. I'll be back in about 10 minutes or so. Yeah. I'll think about how I'm going to approach this responsibility thing, because it's kind of a long.
Yeah, it's a big concept, so.
All right, I'll be back.
Okay, we're back. Hi.
Okay, so I'm back. So responsibility.
Hell yeah.
How to word this? It's not really something I've actually tried to explain before, but it's sort of tied to everything else I was saying. So, as far as I'm concerned, it's the player's responsibility to succeed. So, when we were talking about the iron sights and stuff like that, and the great bow, I was thinking about the great bow, and I thought, okay, so I'm gonna give you a ranged attack that's really strong, and I want you to actually have to aim in. So, this is a game where I'm probably not gonna let you aim up or down vertically with your melee attacks, because of how many weird issues are going to crop up. So you're going to have to be careful about fighting on stairs, but your hit test is going to be pretty generous, so it shouldn't be really, in general, that hard to hit stuff on stairs. But I mean, like I said, we'll see. But the bow is different, because it's going to be something you aim, and I'm not going to give you first person, and it's going to fire a actual projectile that you have to actually aim with it. And you're going to be pretty vulnerable while you're charging it up, but it's going to be an enormous amount of damage. You're going to want to use it. So it's my responsibility as a developer to set you up with something that is both useful and not too strong. So enemies have to be able to recognize you're using this. They have to be able to either avoid it or interrupt you or otherwise attack you or do something about it if you haven't gone through the steps necessary to actually set them up to be hit with this thing. Either through terrain or through stunning them or whatever. So, in response to that, there'll be no cooldowns for using this kind of stuff. It'll be all come down to the interaction. Which means we look at the player as their responsibility. So the camera, when we talk about Supreme Commander's camera and stuff like that, the camera restriction and the argument against it all basically came down to the developers didn't want to have the players be responsible for paying attention to the game. So Supreme Commander is a very, very casual game. Even at the highest level, you really don't need much APM to play it. And micro, reclaiming trees and stuff as you move your commander around, is frowned upon. And according to Supreme Commander players, 150 APM, which is basically the average APM of most of the people I know of across 3 hours, is considered a click fest. Now that's accounting for spam as well. So they don't even understand the concept of spam or warm-ups, which is typically where the click fest thing comes in from, is warm-ups. So they don't want the players to have responsibility. They'd rather there be no micromanagement at all. Now, I think some people might draw a strange correlation to these observations to the general disliking for micro maps. But there is a very large distinction, and that is where we draw upon the concept of responsibility. So like I said, in regards to balance, I balance everything by perceived power budget. How potentially powerful is something. That's why science vessels and defilers cost a lot, even though they don't have attacks, even though they're comparatively squishy. I would even argue that defilers should cost more, because they're so powerful. And the reason why they're expensive is because of their potential power budget. Now, the Defiler's potential power budget is absolutely absurd in certain matchups because of Dark Swarm and Plague. Plague can do thousands and thousands of unavoidable damage just because units got close. It's pretty fucking strong. A lot like Storm, but even worse than Storm because it hangs around. Storm you can move out of. And imagine a Psy Storm stacked. So...
Fuck me, man.
So I was thinking about the perceived cost. So that's why I said when I was talking about Apex J and the large ships and the higher tech trees and stuff like that, we'd be talking about thousands to tens of thousands of resources to build these things. Because I think it's the player's responsibility to work with their investment. So when you have a Defiler or a High Templar or a Science Vessel, they can do a lot of damage. For a low-level player, they can do a lot of damage. For a high-level player, they can do a lot of damage. But it's going to be the higher-level player that makes the absolute most out of them. So I balance the power budgets and stuff like that based on the absolute highest echelon. It doesn't mean that the lower-level player can't take advantage of it. It's just that the higher-level player doesn't feel inclined to only use this because it's so efficient. So I think of efficiency, again, from an engagement perspective. So things like, for example, the Corvette with its multi-hit attacks and stuff like that. I factor in, what is the potential damage this thing can do? Well, because of its range, it's very effective. But the camera plays a large role in this. In order to really maximize the range of these long-range units, you have to sort of pay attention to 2 screens worth of space at once. Because the Corvette can attack stuff that's slightly off the screen. So you have to sort of pay attention to stuff that's going on, not just with what you're attacking, but with what's going on around you. So in an ideal situation, there's enough going on that you feel pressured to be cautious about your environment. Which means that if you get caught up position, then you will lose stuff and take a big hit. It's the same thing as science vessels. You don't want Scourge ramming into your science vessels. If your science vessels are out of position, you're going to lose a lot of investment, not just in gas and minerals, but also in time, positioning, map control, and potentially a lot of other units that depend upon those science vessels for things like detection, irradiate, or even EMP in some cases. So it's your responsibility as a player to make use of the power in which you are given. So responsibility is a concept I bring into the interaction concept when I hand somebody something that is sort of specialized. Because I don't like dealing in binary interactions. And a good comparison, again, pulling back to League of Legends, is the abundance of point-and-click abilities. Especially in a game that is predominantly about skill shots. So one of the changes that really sunk my faith within Riot was when they nerfed the fuck out of AP in Italy.
Yeah.
And they turned her into a jungler. So I had invested probably hundreds of hours into Nidalee for the sole purpose of mastering how to land spears at the absolute maximum range. And I used quick cast with no indicators. I did not like the delay that the indicators gave me. It was all completely from memory. And I got to the point where I could go 15-0 with Nidalee in a gold game. It got to the point where I could even 1v5 with Nidalee in certain matchups, where you had somebody disconnect, the rest of my team was doing terribly, and I was able to pull us out of that match. And this was all because I had gotten good at the spears. Now, the thing about Nidalee spears is they're long range, they're slow moving, and the collision is kind of offset. So landing them really isn't that easy, but also anybody who's really paying attention can actually generally predict where you're going to throw the spears, and it can be really hard to actually land them. But at the end of the day, if you do manage to land them, especially against a squishier target, that's a lot of damage. So instead what Riot did is they nerfed it into the fucking ground, and they turned it into a forced synergy ability that's reliant on her other skills, which force you to go into melee range, which is not good if you're playing AP. They basically gutted her as a caster, and then became a jungling nightmare balancing hell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then they would then go on to rework her like 5 different other times with pretty modern, like drastic changes to her abilities. Short of an actual rework, it's pretty insane. So yeah, they clearly didn't do it with
all the changes to the marks and traps and everything on top of it.
Yeah.
It was a disaster.
Well, traps used to like stun them too, right? Like,
yeah,
it's so ridiculous.
Yep. And all because they didn't like the fact that if people didn't pay attention and someone else was good with throwing spears, people would complain that they did a lot of damage. But there's a lot of things in this game that do a lot of damage that are a lot easier to land. It's just the way that the hero played that attracted her, to certain playstyles. And they didn't like that. So, in an objective sense, Nidalee really wasn't that great in the high level. But in the low level, especially when there were skill differences between her and her opponents, the spears could be quite strong. Especially in like ARAM and stuff like that. Of course, balancing around ARAM is moronic, which is precisely why Riot started doing it. And it just got so stupid because you have Vhagar, who, if you go into range, you die because he just points and clicks. If you go into range of Nautilus, you probably are going to lose the game, actually, because he points and clicks.
Yeah.
And like, there's so many of these things that you just go near them and just point and click and you're dead. So instead of reworking the stuff to actually require some degree of, skill to use, they start nerfing the stuff that actually does require skill to use. And that's kind of stupid.
Yeah, they also removed a bunch of animation cancels from Nidalee, even after the rework. Like, there was still a bunch that were left, and they gutted those eventually.
Yep. Yeah, they made her really annoying to play. And that was dumb. That's dumb. Because the game went through several major stages of evolution, and I wasn't there for all of them. But early on, they didn't really understand too much besides Dota is successful, so we're going to make Dota, but as a game. So you have a lot of these very archaic, simple heroes like Garen, Vhagar, Master Yi and stuff like that, that are absurdly powerful because of how little you actually really interact with them at the concept. Master Yi was basically Alpha Strike, and then smack things, and then steroids, and that's it. Garen is just use skills, and that's it. And execute when they're low health. It's very, very simple, very binary. He either succeeds or he doesn't. And he gives you the tools to succeed because all of his power budget is lumped into being survivable. And then, of course, Vhagar, he scales off of enemy AP. They have to itemize against you. They have to basically build an entire item set to deal with you, which already gimps them, without you even doing anything. You don't even have to be a successful Vhagar to really screw up certain team compositions, because if they don't itemize against you, you are just going to kill them. But if you do happen to be good, especially with his newer skill sets, it's even more retarded. But a lot of these heroes, the way they interact, because as the game evolved, they started being like, okay, let's throw in skill shots. You've got Ahri, you got Nidalee, you got Orianna to an extent. You've got even Yasuo to a small extent. A lot of these really depend on hitting certain things that rely on you knowing the missile speed and the enemy knowing your missile speed and stuff like that. So those were interesting. But they kept these point-and-click heroes in the game, and what you got instead was utility creep. So utility, I classify utility as something that exceeds the expression of power budget. So let's say, for example, stuns. So a stun cannot be expressed in a power budget very easily because it exceeds the power budget. When you stun something, you take away their ability to interact, you get absolute free reign on them. Which means that no longer can you calculate how effective something is in cost or whatever, because you have actually removed their effectiveness. You've nullified their effectiveness. You've nullified everything. So you've given yourself like a variable exponential increase in effectiveness and nullified theirs completely. So when we look at stuns, they should be very, very rare and only for a very, very short amount of time, which is why every single fucking hero in League of Legends, especially tanks, has gap closers and stuns. So, and percentage health damage, because they work themselves into this point where as they try, basically Riot has this very juvenile design problem that Blizzard would get into as well with Blizzard Dota. In that they would look at a release and they'd be like, okay, we need more money. We got to one-up our last release. So they got to make them do more and more zany things until you reached the then pinnacle of stupidity, which was Thresh. So Thresh's Q is fucking insane. Not only is it like Blitzcrank's grab, in that if you hit somebody with it, you're basically going to guarantee a kill because you can pull them closer to you, but it also stuns them for even longer, and you can pull yourself towards them. So Blitzcrank is one of the most powerful supports in the game, especially for lower level, because you pull enemies towards you. And this is a game where most heroes will die within less than a second of being slightly out of position. So if Blitzcrank manages to land his hooks, he becomes known as God Hand. Everybody dies around him. Blitzcrank can also kill enemy heroes very easily as a support because he does a surprisingly large amount of burst damage, and he can be surprisingly tanky thanks to his passive. He also tends to itemize as a tank, but I've seen a lot of horrifyingly effective AP Blitzcranks in my time too. And Blitzcrank does have other CC in his arsenal. He has the knock-up, and he has his ult, which is a silence. Now, Thresh also has a knock-up. His just happens to be an AoE knock-up, and he can pull them in any direction he wants. So, again, he manages to outshine Blitzcrank. Thresh is also tanky by extent of his lantern, where he collects the souls. And he just passively stacks, I think, armor and maybe AP. And
yeah, it's a little bit of both. It's a bunch of invisible shit on top of everything else that he already has that's much more visible.
This is very non-interactive. So unlike Blitzcrank, where he relies on his passive, and I think it may be based on his maximum mana, Thresh just is passively getting tankier and tankier all the time. In addition to the fact that his lantern is a big, powerful safety net, where he can yank people from, like, in some cases it seems like halfway across the fucking map, because he can throw his lantern, hook somebody, and then somebody can click his lantern and he can hook, and I think it may pull them towards him. I know I've seen some very, very long distance lanterns.
Yeah, as long as he's like, moving the lantern, and the lantern is not as fast as him or whatever, then yeah, that'll happen.
He can, he's deceptively capable of a lot of interactivity that you really wouldn't expect him to be able to do. You don't look at Thresh and think of him as being hyper-mobile, but he is. And then his ultimate is basically like a cage with slow, and that deals damage. So again, it's a lot like Blitzcrank's ult, except instead of silences, it basically paralyzes them when they walk into it. So both of them still have some, unique characteristics about them. Blitzcrank pulls them completely towards them, whereas Thresh pulls them about halfway. But Thresh overall, basically, in a nutshell, he does what Blitzcrank does, just better. There's some cases you might want Blitzcrank over Thresh for his movement speed or, for his silence over the wall or whatever. But in most cases, Thresh has been, as far as I know, one of the most highly contested supports ever since he was introduced. So Thresh represented this, new standards of what makes the perfect support. He's tanky. He can deal some damage. There was the auto attack. It was one of the items that I think have been since removed or reworked. But he basically could touch you and instantly rip off half of your health. That got nerfed. But he's tanky. He's very good at keeping his ADC alive and anybody else alive he needs to keep alive. He can escape in many parts of the map by hooking creeps and rappelling over walls. He's got CC. He's got ways to sort of peel, and he stuns people for a really long time. He's basically everything you want. He's perfect. Versus Soraka, who is straight healer, and Blitzcrank, who can hook, and if he doesn't hook, it basically he's kind of useless for a while. And there's some other supports I don't remember. Oh yeah, Sona, who's basically like a passive healer. And Blitzcrank can just shield people. He can lantern them. He opens up so much. And the better you get with him, and the better your team gets at playing around him, the more ridiculous he gets. Whereas like with Soraka and stuff like that, it really depends. At least before her rework, it really just depends on you just pushing buttons and healing people, and that's it. And yeah, he's got utility. And it's hard to balance around that because suddenly you have one hero that can do so fucking much versus a lot of these older heroes that really can only do 2, maybe 3 things. But sometimes those 2, maybe 3 things are so absurdly, stupidly strong that when you reach certain matchups, which are very possible when you've got 100+ fucking heroes in your game, where you have heroes that because their kits are so different and because they have to itemize around that, they're absolutely fucked in certain matchups to the point where it's just absolutely fucking absurd.
Yeah, League of Legends is a case study in why you don't just continually release and rework champions for the sake of making money if you want to have a balanced game.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a game filled with tons of microtransactions. So they say it's not for money, but it is. It's always for money.
That's also, Absolutely. Like some champions are undertuned when they come out, but most of them end up being like...
That's by an extent of the developers not knowing what they're doing.
Yeah, like what they actually would like to do is make it so that these champions are very, very strong. And I think a lot of part of it goes back to our conversation about psychology of like this is a new asset in a game that you haven't played against this, you haven't played with this, so you don't really know how capable it is unless you play it on the PBE or something, and I don't even know if that's still running. So like you get all these weird interactions with new champions, and some people have said in the past that like the reason why Riot does this is because they want to get your money, and they want you to buy this champion while it's still hot before they nerf it.
That's why they increase the cost for the first week or two when it comes out, so they can fleece you just a little bit more, because a lot of people cannot stop themselves from impulse buying.
Yeah, I mean I know people who spent thousands of dollars on League, so it's pretty embarrassing.
Jesus. So that's depressing.
You were about to bring up Urgot as a case of an older champion, or maybe he's
Urgot
seen a rework.
He's seen a rework and he's even stronger. But before, he was basically very non-interactive. He would track his. Normally, he had to skill shot his Q, and I can't remember old Urgot that well. All I remember is that against certain heroes, Urgot was extremely annoying, because he would basically itemize as a tank, but he still did a lot of damage, and he can swap locations, which was pretty strong in certain circumstances, but the new one just flat out kills you. And
well, you were talking about point and click abilities. This literally is just like, hey, are you below a certain threshold? All right, you're dead, bye. It also like fears units near him when this happens.
The old one still had the lock on projectiles, right?
Yeah, the old one, like the old one did have the lock on. You'd E them, and that would make it lock on. But E was a projectile. It had a pretty long travel or slow travel time in general. So it was like a slow moving projectile. And people who played against it like knew the splash radius wasn't really that huge. So it was it was definitely strange.
The reason why Urgot comes up, because I actually ran into him in top lane. So I played with the guy who smokes weed, and a lot of weed, and one of his main heroes was Urgot, and he wanted to practice Urgot against some top lanes, because he was struggling in top lanes. And he thought, well, Urgot seems to be pretty strong against certain top laners. Let's try out some matchups. So basically, what it came down to is that if he can land his E, his opponent can't actually ever go near the creep wave until it wears off, because Urgot will zone them and always hit them with his Q no matter what. While that debuff is active, it tracks him and it will do a lot of damage. Since Urgot is so tanky, you really can't dive him a lot of the time, especially since a lot of the top laners are melee. So Urgot would actually become extremely irritating to fight, because so long as he could land his E, which is not really that difficult against a melee opponent, because if you want to get CS, if you want to get money, you are going to have to go near the creeps. So there's only like really one direction you can go in. Just the fear of being hit by this and the amount of damage you're going to take if you do get hit by it is usually enough to discourage you, unless you can bait it out. But there are other, like, there's a lot of matchups just because of the way that Urgot would itemize it. He just became super, super stupid. Once he managed to get like a frozen heart and some other shit, he was basically, unkillable for a lot of the champions in the game. And he would just dominate his lane. Now, there's plenty of heroes like that. Like, say, for example, Nasus. But it would be really stupid because of the auto-aim specifically. But, I mean, like, the point-and-click stuff is really just, like, since a lot of the heroes in the game, including a lot of the melee ones, rely on stuff that really require precision to hit, I feel like there should never be a case where something is automatically handed to you. I think that there always should be player responsibility. So this also goes into anything that does stuff passively. There is so much shit in the game that's hidden behind passives, like Thresh's armor bonus as passive.
Right, and we're not, to be clear, we're not talking about passives as in you don't have, like, shit that you don't have to push a button to activate. We're talking, like, that's behaviors or whatever in an RTS sense or whatever. Like, we're talking actually, like, for people who aren't familiar or less familiar with League, there's abilities and that they have to use themselves. And then there's passives, which are as the name implies, they give passive benefits of some kind that you can work around. And so like that's where like Thresh collects souls as time goes on, and the more souls he collects from fallen champions and units, the stronger he gets as far as his armor, the more AP he gets, which passively increases his damage a little bit to help him scale. And it's like clearly they couldn't figure out how to give his stats a happy medium. This is an attempt, I think, to make it so that he stays as a support in the long term, because if he, theoretically you could play him with a more damage-oriented kit if his abilities had higher base damages or higher scaling damages, because the whole point is that this is supposed to help him scale into the game without making him really, really strong at early levels or strong as like a brawler or something. It's more of a symptomatic of the whole like play this champion the way we want you to play it kind of thing. So.
I think that the whole forced role thing, like forcing and saying this is a support, this is a tank, like in general, that is systematic of a really, really bad game design. Like things should be played this way because the players determined it, because the players figured it out, not because the developer said, hey, do it this way because we told you to and we'll ban you if you don't. Like Singed is a tank. He has CC. He does damage. He can survive. He, on paper, can make a decent support. But now they will just ban you if you play him as support. Like that doesn't even make any sense. Just because, they don't call him a support, suddenly that means he's not a support. It's like the Bruiser bottom line. Well, why do we need a support and a range carry? If we got 2 fucking strong melee burst damage, we can destroy our lane, get a lot of money, and snowball the rest of the map. We still win the game, right? Like suddenly that, breaks this fucking meta that they have to enforce. The enforced meta. Very silly. But also, this kind of behavior takes out responsibility of the player. So like I was saying, skill expression turning into power and making the use of power budget, we enter the interaction that I consider responsibility. So I'm perfectly fine with a champion like Nidalee dealing a huge amount of damage at a longer range than other stuff, because for one, it takes a lot of skill to actually hit those consistently, and C, or B, or whatever, 3, the opposing player has a responsibility to actually avoid these things. They actually have to avoid them, because AP Nidalee is incredibly squishy, and there's, champions that can catch up to her pretty easily. And, that's like a balance, right? But the players have to actually play around that. And if it lasts around long enough, people will figure that out. Kind of like how StarCraft. See, this brings us into StarCraft again, because think about the patch history for StarCraft 1. It's very short. Think about the patch history for StarCraft 2, where they just don't know what the fuck to do with that game ever. StarCraft 2 remains impossibly volatile, with huge sweeping changes constantly being flung at it, and the developers never having any idea what to do. They're just throwing shit at a dartboard and just, have like a patch of the month or whatever. And that's the same issue Relic had with Dawn of War and stuff like that, where they started implementing hard caps on everything because they didn't know how to balance the game. Meanwhile, StarCraft has had basically 0 balanced patches for years and years and years, and even when it was still being actively patched, it was very little. And StarCraft 1 is not a perfectly balanced game, but the players played around that. They played around it, and it became balanced by extent of the map design and the player styles. And StarCraft 1 is more balanced than any RTS after it will ever become, because of the mindset the developers have when approaching it. The developers don't want to give players the responsibility of figuring out how to play the game, how to understand the game, and how to work around what they perceive as imbalances. The developers for, especially Blizzard and Riot and companies like them, are so fucking full of themselves that even though they're garbage at the game, they still think they know better than the players enough to the point that they can arbitrarily decide how the game should be played, rather than players actually how they want to play it. Instead, the developer should be looking at how the players want to play it, and how that impacts the game, and how to expand upon that. Why do they want to play like this? So, when I think about these ARPGs and my interactions with them, and the hit recovery shit and the QTEs and enemies always being inconsistent, I always think about how fucking frustrating it is that I cannot play an aggressive game. That I cannot play a game in which my decisions actually matter. I'm always stuck playing basically QTE. Let's take Dark Souls, for example. There's a lot of times in Dark Souls where you can hit recovery enemies, even in heavy armor, but it's super, super, super inconsistent. And then when they start attacking, they just decide they can't be hit recovered again. They just decide they're unstunnable, just out of the blue. There's nothing that tells the player that this is happening. If there's an underlying system, I haven't figured it out across like 200 hours in this game. Like, it just doesn't make any fucking sense to me why stuff just randomly can't be interrupted. It just doesn't make any sense. It's not poise. It's something else related to the way their attacks work. And they don't have stamina on top of it. They just have all these special rules that just aren't telegraphed, like passives. And what that means is that a lot of the times you think you can do something and you actually can't. And that means that you basically have to play a quick time event. So I remember watching a speedrun in GDQ for Dark Souls 3. And this person claimed they were going to do Pontiff Sullivan, which is one of the more, complex and difficult bosses of the game, blindfolded. Now that seems pretty interesting, I thought. This player must have a really strong sense of how the audio cues work in this game when I can't figure out what the fuck is going on at all. So I'm very curious to see how she's going to do this. It turns out that if Pontiff Sullivan does something other than a specific attack when the fight starts, the player is just going to reset the fight. And she's going to continue to reset the fight until he does this one ability. Because when he does this one ability, you can move in a certain direction and then initiate basically a quick time event, because he's always going to do the same thing after this point because he follows a rotation. The AI follows a rotation. Which means that once you master that starting point, and then the rest of the points after it, you can kill him blindfolded. So it really wasn't even fighting the boss blindfolded. It was figuring out a sequence and then performing that sequence blindfolded. So it was really far less impressive than it sounded. Which was funny because here I thought that people were good players. But no, it just turns out that they figured out a sequence and they performed it.
As a side note,
congratulations.
Isn't it really funny when you get into situations where people are saying this is hard or this is difficult, and you go in and you, as a player who you maybe have some confidence in your history with the titles and the genre, but you're not like a star player in any capacity, and then you trivialize whatever the fuck they're talking about, or
DMC5 is like that.
Yeah.
DMC5 is probably one of the easiest games I've played. The Virgil fight was really frustrating, and I ended up using an orb on that to get out of it because of how angry I was getting. But the rest of the game was extremely easy. Extremely easy. When I first started, I had a little bit of a rough spot with the first boss, the fire demon guy, in part because of the way and some of his abilities worked and how disoriented I was getting in some spots, but also because I just wasn't really confident with Nero's moveset. But especially when we reached Dante, a lot of the bosses in the game are just flat out one-shotted, which is weird because I would then read feedback that people considered Dante's moveset to be too difficult to use, which was really strange because it was basically the strongest it had ever been. And the enemies in the game were way easier than in DMC4 or DMC3, especially 3 by a long shot, because I got hooked up on some fights on DMC3 for an hour and a half, 2 hours at a time. And DMC5 was way easier than DMC4. It was just a very trivial game. And this is from someone who hadn't even played games for a very long time, was not playing anywhere near even my own shitty peak performance. And this was a game that also didn't even have turbo. It wasn't even as fast as DMC4. It was actually a slower game. So it to hear that anybody would consider this game remotely difficult, frustrating, and maybe you might die a few times, especially when you're not paying attention, but actually difficult, that's absurd to me, because a lot of the bosses won't even attack you when you're in the air. Like, Urizen would not attack me when I'm in the air most of the time. I would take, I didn't even know what was even going on in that fight. I just sat in the air just smacking him and he died. And then there was the Nero Angelo fighter, or whatever the fuck he was called, the second one that you fight with Dante. I just obliterated him. I didn't even know what the fuck he was doing. He didn't even get the chance to even do anything half the time.
Yeah, you'll notice half of these fights, or more than half probably, don't feel like actual fights or duels or anything.
Because they're not. They're just not fights. Like, you never really feel like you're being threatened. Like, the Virgil fight was so frustrating in that, because they tried to copy the Virgil fight from DMC3, which, okay. But then they slowed it down, and they made his moveset so much more annoying and inconsistent to deal with. Sometimes you could walk out of his air attack. Other times you couldn't, and by air attack I mean ranged attack. And his flying phase was some of the dumbest, most irritating shit in the entire game. Because of the insane hit collision projectiles on you, that in order to destroy them is basically you have to RNG if you're actually going to destroy them all or not before he came down and hit you a second time. And then he had his Katana QTE thing, which was the most non-threatening thing in the game, where he just makes an indicator and stands there, and if you stand in it, you get hit. It was dumb. It was really, really, really dumb.
Yeah, you definitely feel respected by the developers when they give you a fucking Simon Says.
This was the final fight, so I was hoping that we had like a real honest to God fight, but they didn't. It was really frustrating. And then you fight him a second time with Nero, and suddenly you can stun him and stuff all over again. Like suddenly he becomes way more weaker to Nero. You can stun him and CC him and do stuff you weren't really able to do before, and his moveset felt weaker as well. So yeah, like it felt like a big middle finger, because this whole game had been so mediocre to that point. It was probably one of the worst. I would say it was definitely the worst DMC game. Probably worse than DMC. But It felt like a shitty carbon copy of DMC. And I went through so much of it. Like, I had difficulty in some parts, but I got through those parts without even, like, trying to understand the game. Like, the game didn't put upon me the responsibility to actually learn it, to actually figure it out. And that's one of the reasons why I had difficulty on Virgil, because now you had to actually have some kind of finesse over the mechanics to get away from his damage volumes that I didn't have, because the rest of the game didn't tell me to learn these skills. It didn't tell me to do anything.
Yeah, 100%.
The rest, especially Dante's side, had been so fucking brain dead effortless to go through that I just basically just mashed buttons and just like fell asleep. And then suddenly you were met with a boss that had a whole bunch of invulnerability timings, was very evasive, and then would just hit you out of the blue with stuff. So you had to actually like start paying attention and play consistently. It was like playing a completely different game. And there was no consistency. There was no asking for responsibility. And at the same time, when you look at all this stuff as well, all these games, RTS, ARPG, whatever, DMC, God of War, whatever, we don't give the player a lot of responsibility. Even in a game like Dark Souls, which you could construe as being more like superficially difficult, I wouldn't call Dark Souls a hard game by any extent. It kills the player, but it doesn't make it difficult. But you can fall off of ledges and stuff in it, which you can't in normal games and stuff like that. But like even at the absolute like most favorable comparison for Dark Souls really doesn't put a lot of responsibility in the hands of the player, because a player really isn't handed a lot of stuff that is powerful. They don't really get to decide the pace of a lot of things. Now, of course, if you go and watch like a speedrun or something like that without context, it's going to feel like the player has a lot of control, because they've put in the tens of thousands of hours it takes to learn every single, point of stagger, every single hit it takes to stagger something in these games. So it's going to seem like they can just walk up and stun things at a will, or they know precisely where to go and what to avoid and stuff like that. But average gameplay, a lot of it is basically you are at the whim of RNG and luck, and basically following the pace the game has set for you. You cannot set the pace on a lot of this stuff. And it becomes worse when things get really, really grindy. Have you watched the Dante's Inferno run?
Yeah, I watched enough of it, like the early segments. I also played like the first half of that game, so I have some experience with it. It was not a good title. I played it on the Xbox, so it was...
I really highly recommend watching the last segment.
Okay.
Because the last 3 or 4 segment, I mean, I would watch the whole thing if I were you, just to see how bad these games really go.
Yeah.
Because Dante's Inferno is one of the worst ARPGs in existence. Maybe only Conan and Alice 1 are really like worse. But
I think it's pretty competitive with all of them, honestly. Like it's one of those games where
they're all up there.
Yeah, like some intern push buttons. Like I think that you described it as like some like we got to make the difficulty level in 5 seconds. Quick, fucking increase stats, make it so that on the hardest difficulty or the second hardest difficulty, that one attack deals 3 times your max health. Like what the fuck?
Yep.
Like that in and of itself is a nice microcosm of how like they did no testing and they had no vision.
So the last boss, I'll spoil this for you because you probably won't watch
Okay.
it for a little while. The last boss, his first phase, he one-shots you with a map-wide AoE that he uses in a sequence. So what you've got to do is you have to play Simon Says. And if you do something Simon doesn't say, Simon runs over you with his goat cock and he stuffs it down your throat and breaks open your ribcage and kills you. This was their idea of a boss fight. Now, the second phase, I have to turn down the difficulty in the second phase because it was not possible for me to do. I had watched a video in which somebody had done it, and I don't know how a person could force themselves through the hundreds of hours it would take to actually do this, the second and third phases of this boss on the highest difficulty, because of the sheer amount of health that this fucking boss has and how much damage he does to you, where he can basically two-hit you. And you are fighting this guy for a very, very, very long time, where he is doing, you have to like frame perfect evasion and parries on him over and over and over and over and over to survive his damage. That's the only way to survive. Actually, the funny thing is I actually almost managed to stun lock him, because there is a attack in that game, and I think it's very unintentional, that you can stun him with it. But as I got him towards low health, he stopped being stunnable, and then he ended up killing me. But I got very, very close to spamming one ability and killing him with it. But that game is like an exercise of the player not being able to do fucking anything. And God of War is a lot like that. Like, all the telegraphic fights in all games are like that. But especially these games where you fight trash and you CC them. And then you stun lock them in a corner and you beat their faces in. And what you're going to find that as you watch Dante's Inferno is that there are enemies in the game where their wake up is coupled with an attack that deals like a quarter of your health and damage, is unavoidable, and has insane range on it. Where if you go into a fight and miss time one thing, you die. And it's a very, very long trash fight. You are going to have a wacky time watching that run if you've not seen the later half of that game.
No, I don't think I've ever seen it in my own experience or otherwise. I think I stopped after the fucking succubus boss battle, whatever.
That's nothing. That's nothing compared to
it seemed that was pretty bad too. Like, she summoned some cuck, or something. I don't really remember how that worked.
Yeah, those fights were retarded.
You like how that game also just what really disturbs me about that title? Maybe because I haven't played the whole thing. This is what gets me most, but. Like, it's so fucking annoying that the game looks that fucking bad. Like, it looks so bad.
Yeah.
Just visibly.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
Conan looks a lot worse, but Dante's Inferno is still, like, just disgusting.
Yeah.
Conan looks like Diablo 3, basically. It's
well, you notice, like, all these games are doing the same thing that Diablo 3 actually did, where they don't have full motion cutscenes. They have these fucking, like, weird comic booky type things. Yep. And that's what happens in Dante's Inferno as well. They start out with a full motion cutscene, and then they, like, zoom into his chest, and it becomes this art project. Like, what the fuck?
They just decide that they're too lazy to do pre-rendered scenes anymore. It's become less and less and less. I don't understand that, like... Diablo 3 is also a great comparison as well, because it's a game which you can't tell what the fuck is going on at any point. So, one of the things about when you hand player responsibility and ask them to perform well is you have to hand them the information they need to perform well. So, let's say, for example, the guns and our insights and stuff like that. A lot of these games that implement firearms and a lot of shooters, they have an arbitrary recoil. Counter-Strike does not. It scales up. But a lot of the games, the guns start firing at basically maximum recoil. So you think you've aimed somewhere, but you haven't. Because the recoil sends your bullet like 30 degrees to the left or something like that with your first shot. So I've run into that a lot of times. Where, guns have maximum recoil on the start, and it's really stupid. But also, a lot of like arbitrary hand-holding and restrictions and stuff like that. So you might think of like the tech trees as really the same thing. We saw that a lot in Frozen Throne, where Blizzard didn't want to make a map, so they just start like removing stuff from your tech tree,
removing abilities from heroes as well. Yeah.
Yep. So they just decide, we don't need to have this.
Yeah.
So we're just gonna remove it. Yeah.
I like it when when I was doing my playthrough of Frozen Throne and they just disabled Kale's ultimate for an ability. I just went.
Yep.
I actually lost my shit in that video. I was so fucking angry. It's like that's like his giant portion of his fucking kit is just disabled. It's like I guess it's a good thing that the AI is also disabled because otherwise you're literally gimping like one of the most important abilities in the game.
Yeah, it was pretty fucking bad.
Yeah,
like. So. They don't want to make a map and then give you something strong and then let you have the responsibility how to use it and then face you with a challenge. They would rather just remove everything entirely because it doesn't fit their perfect, Excel spreadsheet. I don't think they even had the foresight to have fucking Excel spreadsheets in Warcraft 3. I think that everybody was just designer Dave and just didn't know what they were doing at all.
I also like that. Ironically enough, Kale's ultimate is probably one of the least offensive spells in the game, just because like it does reward positioning, and I don't really like the fact that it deals self damage. But the idea that if you just normalize the health values and you made it threatening, but if they kill it over unbuildable terrain or unwalkable terrain, I should say, then it just dies. So like that's positional elements, because that limits how harassment oriented you can make the flyer in the first place, and just the idea
you also
that
have to bring in close to enemies to make the most of it. So
right, yeah, because it deals that passive extra damage, which is also positional. So like in theory, that's actually a pretty decent ability to start with, and then you fix the stats and you make it so that there's no fucking cooldown associated with it. You're just managing energy, managing mana. Like that's another thing is like I feel like. Unless it's like a weapon style cooldown where it's like a second or something like with Psystorm or Radiate.
Cooldowns are dumb.
Just they're dumb. The idea that you're gonna have like a 60-second cooldown on some abilities is just so wacky in an RTS.
World of Warcraft is filled with like 3, 4, 5-minute cooldowns, and I have to ask, what is the fucking point? Okay, you don't want people burning huge steroids during boss fights all the time, then don't have huge fucking steroids. Like, steroids are some of the most boring fucking ability designs you can have, along with passives. Ooh, I pushed a button and now I attack faster and do more damage. Gee, that's sure fucking exciting.
I also like when these abilities that they have for you that have these insanely long cooldowns just wind up being stuff that you push on cooldown anyway. Like, even,
yep.
You know what I mean? So, I think there's a really big foundational, like, issue with all of the abilities in MOBAs and in RTS games that try to have heroes or whatever. That's why I've avoided putting cooldown systems in there. Like there's some stuff that I'm still working out the kinks for. Like one of the relics for the Protoss and Hydra is gives you a blink, and by default it has a 10-second cooldown on it, but you can, by killing a unit, you reduce it by 1 second. I don't know if the numbers will be final, but the idea was to make it so that you can blink again. Like maybe instead it'll be like, it costs energy and you restore energy on like per kill or something like that. But then it also synergizes with other relics, so I would have to change up the balance because who knows what else you can do with that. But I like some idea like that better, so that you're not beholden to some arbitrary like timer before you can use your ability again, because like it's weird to say, but I think if you have a cooldown, it actually encourages you to like watch the unit more than if there is no cooldown. Because like in an RTS context where you're also building a base and building an army and stuff, if you're trying to also remember cooldowns in your head, like as a player, that's really counterintuitive, because you're like nothing else in the game is like that, for one, and for another, you're like trying to balance out a bunch of other timers and stuff. So like when it's going to be as impactful as like a teleport for a melee hero, like so you could say like Zeratul with his 100 fucking damage teleporting around, like that's going to be pretty impactful. If you limit that with a cooldown, like suddenly players are going to be like thinking about that a little too much and probably microing a little too much on that. And of course it is their responsibility to figure out like they're doing that, but also could be improved, I think, from a conceptual standpoint. So I mean, we've talked about a lot of different things in this podcast. Been going for about 2.5 hours now. The main takeaways that I've gotten from this particular episode is just that, when you're handling player tools and balancing and stuff like that, it's really important to consider everything from a bigger picture than just what maybe like you're observing something that's like your changes in a mod or whatever, your new champion for your MOBA, and you see like one matchup or one small case where something is clearly imbalanced or feels imbalanced to you. Like you got to consider what else can be done. Like what is the responsibility of the opponents to counter this sort of strategy or this ability? And to your point, when you talked about how Brood War has never received any balance changes, there have been compositions that initially come out and feel like, holy shit, there's no counter to this, and then 3 months later there is. So Like when you get
people
people
started
who are,
using Valkyries.
mm-hmm.
Nobody ever wanted to use Valkyries. They were a dead unit. Suddenly people started using Valkyries.
Yeah,
Years and
devourers
years and
too.
years in.
So it's like there's so
Yeah.
much that you can do with that changes it up. So like I think when Brood War is a nice example for many reasons, and that is one of them, where you're actually seeing an example of what happens when the developer leaves the responsibility of adapting to the players and doesn't fuck around with stuff. And that's why, like, I've talked about this at length, but when I make my own RTS, my ideal scenario is that you'll have an entire, like, year or a ranked season of however many months. And, you know, at the end of that, that's when I make some changes. So I have as much sort of information as necessary for this sort of thing. I don't end up, you know, jumping the gun and pulling the trigger on something and changing something completely different. Not that any changes would probably end up being too drastic anyways, unless I fucked up on a conceptual level. But again, like, that's why it's important, is to make sure that there is enough time and enough sort of incentive for people to react accordingly. So, like, obviously that's in a more imaginary universe where there's even a market for an esports environment around that, and the game is good enough to be competitive in the first place, and none of that is taken for granted, and nor is it necessarily something I'm designing for to begin with, because as we've all seen, designing to be an esport is such a fucking joke in the first place. But just the idea of, like, that is one of the things that I like about Brood War, is that it has this competitive scene. And if I was theory crafting as to how to improve the competitive scene, I wouldn't say never do any balance changes, because I think you can do a lot more interesting shit with Brood War than what Brood War has. And I think you can do a lot more radical things with map design and balance with that, and new units and all this other shit. So the idea that, like, you'd have I've talked about map rotations before and race rotations, where there'd actually be like 10 races in the game eventually, but only a certain number of them, like 4, are ever available in ranked play and tournament play, because the whole point is, you know, these are the active ones that we have as a community have agreed, that the high level players have all agreed that these are balanced enough that there's enough responsibility and enough agency for the players that they can counter different strategies and stuff. And then the stuff that's a little bit more rough around the edges gets worked on throughout the season and unranked play. And then at the end of the season, now we're swapping one out that of the races and replacing it with another that's like the best contender. And then we work on the one that we swapped out as well. So, like, shit like this is, like, it's not, I don't, again, like, we talked about this at many, many podcasts ago, but, like, I don't consider myself to be some intellectual skeptic man that is outwitting everybody in the fucking industry. I just think, like, some people just don't consider the bigger picture, like we were saying. So that's definitely a big takeaway, I think, for people who are trying to design stuff. And I don't know about you, but I think there's of course a lot more to go on when we do another episode that's like this. For sure,
like I've hardly even scratched the surface of what I'm trying to do with the ARPG. Like there's a lot.
So there's definitely more material here for a revisit somewhere soon. But
it is worth mentioning that you brought up oh fuck, I can't remember what it was now. Open source.
Yes.
But when, like, it's too early, like, I want to eventually continue my educational series, and I am doing recordings for this project as well, but most of the recordings I'm doing at the moment are basically like end of day reports, like, I did this, I did that, this is how it works. But once I actually, like, know what I'm doing, I do intend to release a lot of the information that I have learned and figured out, and things like, say for example, the AI. Because one of the things I've definitely had a lot of problems with Unreal already right out of the gate is finding information that works. You know, people like hard coding stuff into the character blueprint and stuff like that, just right off the bat. Just close the video and move on, because I want to work with the actual proper system and implement things correctly and have it, you know, project friendly as opposed to tutorial friendly. Because a lot of people will set things up, but it's like a very unrealistic way. It's like, oh, I can do this. Oh, sure, I can fucking tell the fucking unit to teleport to a location and push a launch. But have you ever actually tried it, Mr. Tutorial Man? Because you pushed a launch to dash. Guess what? The friction on the ground keeps you from fucking moving. So it doesn't work. You never tested it before posting it and acting like it fucking works, because it doesn't. So when I have stuff figured out, you know, sometime down the line, I do intend to explain how a lot of this stuff is actually done and done correctly. So I am making a developer series for it, and I will eventually use this information to produce more projects for the educational series as well. So as the months come, hopefully without too much worse real life disaster than what's going on right now, because things have been very bad. I will learn more and have more to say on an actual technical and educational level for this stuff, because I don't think I'm going to be capable of educating someone from nothing to 100 on Unreal 4. But if I can provide information, especially in AI, how to do things, especially from a review standpoint, because so many games don't even try to do AI, and we can show how easy it is to do this stuff. I mean, like I said, I have guys navigating Z levels right now, going under bridges, over bridges, jumping up things, and it's really just as easy as placing a point and calling it a day. And these big shot multi-million, multi-billion companies can't even have, two-dimensional fucking Z pathing. It's pathetic. It's very, very pathetic, and it's very important to show how easy this stuff is done, so we can point and laugh at these mongoloids. So,
well, pointing and laughing at mongoloids is basically my job. So,
yep, we will revisit stuff in the future, and I'm sure we'll allow us to explore this a little bit. But for now, it's just learning and figuring things out. So, I'm sure as I come along the way, I'll have more applicable stuff to talk about. But like I said, a lot of this stuff can be still applied to RTS, just because I'm making a different genre. A lot of the stuff I design stuff around is still easily passable from genre, even to turn-based as well.
Yeah, we might end up brushing on that. That's probably the least familiar genre that I think is applicable. That for me, like, I'm not very familiar with that at all. But I'm sure that a lot of these things are translatable, even for stuff like ARPGs, which I've seen you and other people play more than I've actually played myself. So, and I feel like I have a pretty decent grasp of like what is being said and all that stuff. So I'm sure it would be easy enough for everybody else to grasp as well if we did decide to go into the turn-based discussions as an example. But yeah, I mean, I think this was great. We ended up covering a lot of ground, but of course there's room to specialize. And I know people were looking for a more like detailed takedown of RTS tech trees specifically. So maybe we can like do one thing where we talk more specifically about ARPGs and like when you're further along or whenever with your stuff, and we can talk about control systems and whatnot. And then we can do the same sort of thing for RTS as well, because
I can definitely talk about tech trees because I've explored that a lot in my tool conversions. So
yeah, absolutely. So looking forward to that. And did you have any final thoughts on this particular subject, or are we good to go?
Nothing that wouldn't result in another half hour of rambling.
Perfect.
So we may as well leave it off there because anything else can be explored later on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining me once again. Thank you, viewer, for listening. And actually, fuck you. And yeah, bye.
No, smoke weed!